Good morning. Convening the Monday, September 13th, 2021 hearing for the House Investigative Committee to investigate compliance with audit numbers 19-12 and 21-01. Good morning. I'm Chair Della Belatti of this House Investigative Committee. Today I have with me members of the committee. And members, I'm going to start off by doing some brief introductions and opening statement, and then we'll turn to our formal agenda. Okay? So members and the public, I have with me members of the committee, Chair David Tarnas of the Waterland House Committee, Chair Mark Hashem of the House Committee on Agriculture, Chair Dale Kobayashi of the House Legislative Management Committee, Minority Leader Val Okimoto, Vice Chair Amy Peruso of the Agriculture Committee, and Representative Kyle Yamashita, who's responsible for CIP projects with the House Committee on Finance. I believe I've introduced everyone from the committee. Oh, excuse me, and the very most important person, my Vice Chair, Linda Ichiyama, who has been wonderful in helping me set up this committee. In addition to members of the committee, we also have various staff members. Here in the conference room 325 with me, I have staff from House Majority Staff Office, Casey Hines, Chelsea Dugan, and Krislin Maunakea on Zoom. In addition, I have a staff member from my office, Najwa Kadrani, and we have representatives, counsel from the various agencies. Lori Tanigawa is our Deputy AG for the State House. And in addition, we have no other attorneys. And then we also have staff, House Tech staff, Matthew Kondo, who's been wonderful in helping us set up this Zoom hearing today. So before we begin today's hearing, I would like to provide a brief overview of the investigative committee. The House of Representatives formed this investigative committee pursuant to House Resolution 164 that was adopted this past legislative session. This investigative committee was established pursuant to Chapter 21, Hawaii Revised Statutes, which provides the investigative committee with broad powers and certain duties, including the power to compel the attendance and testimony of witnesses and production of evidence through the issuance of subpoenas for the purpose of securing information for the use of the legislature. The purpose of this investigative committee is to follow up on the audit of the Department of Land and Natural Resources Special Land and Development Fund, report number 19-12, and audit of the Agribusiness Development Corporation, report number 21-01, and to examine the recommendations made in those audits for purposes of improving the operation and management of state agencies, their funds, and any other matters of importance that may be supported by the evidence submitted to the committee. The subject matter of both of these audits are critical to the management of state lands. That's one of the primary reasons that we are examining in depth both the process, findings, and recommendations of this audit. Over the next several weeks, the investigative committee will be holding hearings for the purpose of taking testimony or receiving other evidence. The investigative committee's hearing process will be conducted pursuant to Chapter 21 and the rules of the investigative committee. Hearings will be open to the public unless 2/3 of the authorized membership of the investigative committee votes to close the hearing in executive session for a specific and narrow purpose. All testimony given or adduced at the hearings will be provided under oath or affirmation unless dispensed with by a majority vote of the investigative committee members present at the hearing. To that end, the investigative committee will be seeking full transparency from all individuals and agencies involved in audit numbers 19-12 and 21-01 as it examines various issues, either included or omitted by the audits, including those issues related to policy, mismanagement, malfeasance, or fraud. Because objectivity, independence, and being free from conflicts of interest are critical to the investigation process, I would like to, at the outset, disclose a potential conflict of interest that I only became aware of on late Friday evening during my preliminary review of certain documents the committee received from Dlnr pursuant to our subpoenas. I became aware 3 days ago that another attorney at the law firm where I practice consulted with and may have represented a Dlnr employee in a personnel issue with the department in 2016. I've effectively been firewalled from that matter for the past 5 years, as I only became aware of the potential representation 3 days ago and have no knowledge to either confirm or deny such representation or any information pertaining to such representation. I will continue to maintain any necessary firewall and safeguards between my role on this committee and my private law practice in accordance with the House rules and the Hawaii rules of professional conduct, as well as any other best practices for such situations. I will say that I have looked at the Yellow Book standards that apply to government auditing practices for assistance as part of the best practices for such situations. I immediately informed the speaker of the situation on Friday evening, and he has determined that no conflict exists. Therefore, I will continue in my role as chair of this committee and proceed with examining all information that comes before this committee in a fair, impartial, objective, and independent manner. Members, with that, we will begin the taking of testimony, and our first testifier is Auditor Les Condo. Mr. Condo, are you prepared to start with your testimony? And before we do that, I will have to swear you in.
I'm prepared, yes.
Okay. And also, do you have the share screen function, as I understand that you will be presenting a PowerPoint for the committee?
I have it. Well, let's see if I'm allowed to share. Can you see that?
Yes, and you can keep that slide up. Thank you, Auditor.
Thank you.
All right, so Auditor, to begin with, do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes.
Thank you, Auditor. Go ahead and begin your presentation.
Okay, good morning. Thanks for having me. It's good to see all of you. Like I said earlier to some of you, I hope that all of you are staying healthy. First of all, thank you for having this hearing to talk about the Land Division's Special Land and Development Fund audit. The audit was requested by the legislature through a bill passed in 2017. We reported a number of important findings that are deserving of some public discussion and action by Dlnr to improve its management and oversight of public resources, namely the revenue-producing state lands that Dlnr controls and the special fund which holds the revenues from those lands, which is also the funding source for the Land Division and the Office of Conservation in Coastal Lands. The special fund also helps to support the Commission on Water Resource Management, the Division of State Parks, and the Division of Forestry and Wildlife. However, I would be remiss if I didn't note my surprise to having been alerted less than 2 weeks ago that the committee is also examining my office in our work. The resolution that was read by the chair seems to describe the committee's purpose and duties as to follow up on the audits of the SLDF and the Agribusiness Development Corporation, examine the recommendations, and improve the operations and management of those agencies. That said, we have nothing to hide. We did our job and we did it well. I'm going to take the first few minutes to go through and explain a little bit about our audit process. I think it may help the committee understand how we perform our work and why we are confident in the report's findings and recommendations. Now, this is a brochure that we distribute to new legislators to introduce them to our office and our work. Hopefully all of you got a brochure. It was probably a trifold document. Hopefully you all were provided one by my office when you took office. This is a version of that that's posted on our website. And instead of it being a trifold document, it is a one-page document. First, the audits that are the subject of the committee's investigations are performance audits. They're not financial audits. Performance audits and financial audits are very different. Performance audits examine the efficiency and the effectiveness of government programs. We're assessing whether those programs are attaining the objectives and results that the legislature intended, and we offer recommendations to the agencies to address issues that we identify in the course of the audit. In a nutshell, we're trying to make government better. And this is what we do. We provide independent, objective, and meaningful answers to questions about government performance. Our aim is to hold agencies accountable for their policy implementation, program management, and expenditure of public funds. And there's structure to our work, a lot of structure. We are a Yellow Book office, which means that our audits are conducted in accordance with government auditing standards promulgated by the Comptroller General of the United States. These professional standards, which are generally referred to as the Yellow Book, outline in detail the requirements for our audit reports, the professional qualifications of our auditors, and the structure of our quality control program. In short, following Yellow Book guidelines ensures that we are performing high-quality audit work with competence, integrity, objectivity, and independence. Our audit process can be divided up into 4 different stages. At least that's what we talk about in my office internally: planning, fieldwork, reporting, and follow-up. Now, we start an audit by meeting with the agency's management to explain the audit process, to answer questions, to set expectations, both for us as well as for them. That initial meeting with the agency's management kicks off the first phase of the audit, planning. Now, during planning, we try to gain a broad understanding of the agency's operations, how they're performing their duties, their functions. We ask for some high-level documents, things like org charts, policy statements, strategic plans, annual reports. We look at annual budget requests to the legislature. We will often interview selected managers, including the department director or the program chief, and other staff to deepen our understanding of the agency's work. This is how the Yellow Book describes the purpose of the planning stage of an audit. In planning the audit, auditors should assess the significance and audit risk and apply these assessments in defining the audit objectives and the scope and methodology to address those objectives. So once we have a general understanding of an agency, what their activities are, what they do, we develop our audit objectives, which are the specific areas or processes that we intend to analyze. Those objectives become the focus of our audit. We develop audit objectives based upon risk. Now, what I'm showing you is the matrix that we currently use to do our risk assessment. We first identify the audited agency's key activities. Now, those are the activities that are significant to carrying out the agency's purpose or mission. Then we carefully assess the risks, high, medium, or moderate, and low, associated with each of these key activities. Now, program risks are things that could hinder the agency's performance of the key activity and ultimately the agency's ability to achieve the key activity objective. So now, using this investigative committee as an example, a key activity might be to obtain testimony from Dlnr about what it has done to implement the audit recommendations. That might be the key activity that we would put in this matrix at the very top. A program risk might be that Dlnr doesn't participate in the hearing. Now, the magnitude of impact and the likelihood of occurrence are what lead us to determining the significance of program risk. The magnitude of impact is the effect. In other words, it's how significant is it that if the program risk occurs. Now, using the program risk example that Dlnr doesn't participate in the committee's hearing, the magnitude of impact likely is high. If Dlnr doesn't participate, the committee might not be able to obtain a complete understanding of what Dlnr has done to implement recommendations. The likelihood of occurrence is the level of possibility that the risk will occur. Now, in assessing the likelihood of occurrence, we consider the effectiveness of internal controls that the agency has provided us and that we've identified during our planning work. Now, effective internal controls will reduce and sometimes even eliminate the risk. Those internal controls are listed in the column between magnitude of occurrence and the likelihood of occurrence. So now the likelihood of occurrence that Dlnr doesn't participate in the hearing is low. So the committee has controls. It has issued subpoenas compelling certain Dlnr employees to testify about the efforts Dlnr has made to implement recommendations, and it has the power to enforce those subpoenas. The most significant part of the risk assessment is the last column, the significance of program risk. That's the relative importance of a matter in the context in which it is being considered. In other words, if the risk is insignificant, we won't consider the key activity as an audit objective. We'll eliminate that key activity. We don't want to audit a process that's insignificant. Either it's not a big deal if it isn't working well, or it's unlikely the program risk could affect the agency's performance of the key activity. So now we use this chart to determine the significance of program risk. Generally, we consider developing an audit objective relating to the key activity if there's a significant risk, the red areas of the chart. In the example of Dlnr not testifying about its efforts to implement audit recommendations, while the magnitude of impact is high, the likelihood of occurrence is low, like I said. Using the chart, we would deem the program risk to be not significant. So that means we would not consider auditing the committee's process to obtain testimony from Dlnr. In other words, we would not develop an audit objective relating to the committee's process to obtain testimony from Dlnr. Well, the example of the committee's process is really simplistic. In reality, the risk assessment process is a very detailed, very thorough, very time-consuming exercise. It's not simple, but it helps us ensure the audit is sufficiently narrow that we can complete it in the required time frame and with the resources that we have, and that it will likely be meaningful. We are auditing activities that are key to the agency's ability to achieve its mission. And based upon our planning work, we think there is significant risk in the agency's ability to perform those activities effectively and efficiently. Now, the audit objectives are what the audit is intended to accomplish. The detailed risk assessment and the objectives that flow from it form our audit roadmap, which not only points us in the direction of where we should go, but it also stakes out the four corners of where not to go. Having such guidance is critical because in auditing, we cast a very wide net and we often pull in reams of information to sort through. Once we've developed audit objectives, we start our fieldwork. This is the second phase of our audit. We now are looking for specific information relative to the objectives. We take a deeper dive to understand how an agency performs its activities relating to the objectives that we've developed. We often will interview management and staff who we interviewed once before during the planning phase. We will ask for additional documents. We likely will test processes that the agency has developed to perform the key activity, looking at a selected group of transactions. For instance, when we audited the Office of Healthcare Assurance's annual relicensing of adult residential care homes, we reviewed a sample of 214 of 479 care home files. We generally do not look at every inspection. We do not look at every transaction. Now, when the audit team, when it feels that it has gathered sufficient and appropriate evidence to address the audit objectives, they prepare preliminary findings and recommendations, which we call a PF&R. So after the PF&R is prepared, we have a meeting, sometimes multiple meetings, to discuss the PF&R. That discussion includes the audit team as well as all of the managers in the office. We often have lots of discussion about the PF&R, testing the support for the preliminary findings, looking for the root causes of the problem in the agency's processes that we've discovered. Now, once the PF&R is done, we move to report drafting. Now, the drafts go through a number of reviews. Every sentence in the draft is referenced, meaning that factual statements are supported by audit evidence, either documents or audit interviews, and conclusions are based upon that evidence. At the end of every sentence, and I mean every sentence in the draft report, there is an electronic link that goes to the supporting documents. And when we feel the draft is ready, when it's ready to be considered as a final draft, it goes through an independent review process. Another analyst in my office who's not part of the project team is tasked with reviewing the draft and determining whether he or she agrees that each sentence is sufficiently and appropriately supported. And that is for each and every sentence in the report. That independent review process generally takes a week or longer, involves many back and forths between the independent reviewer and the team about the support for sentences that the independent reviewer may question. Now, when the independent review is completed, at that moment, we are confident that the report is factually accurate and supported by sufficient and appropriate audit evidence. But we have another step to make sure that we are solid in our report. We provide the agency with a draft of that report. We don't provide the draft to anyone else outside of the agency. From the beginning of the audit, starting with the entrance conference with the agency, with management, we explain this process, including the agency's opportunity to review the draft before it's published. We also explained that we'll have an exit conference with the agency before we publish the report. And that exit conference is the opportunity for us to discuss the audit findings, especially any disagreement or issue that the agency has with the draft report. And we consider all comments and will revise the report as appropriate. The agency also has the opportunity to provide written comments about the report, which are included as part of the published report. We also include our response to those comments in the report. Now, once that process is done, we've published the report and an auditor's summary as well, providing copies to the agency, to the governor, to the lieutenant governor, to the BNF director, and every legislator. Now, we also post a copy of the report on our website, and we send an email notification to those who have subscribed to receive those notifications. Now, the last step of our audit process is to follow up on the agency's implementation of audit recommendations. Now, we ask agencies to self-report the status of their implementation to us every year, and we publish a consolidated report containing all of the agency's self-reported implementation status. About 2 or 3 years after we issue the audit report, we perform what we call an active follow-up, where we assess the agency's implementation of those recommendations, independently assess, and we issue a report specific to that agency's implementation. In a follow-up, we're generally trying to understand what the agency has done to implement the recommendations, and for those recommendations the agency represents have been implemented or partially implemented, we ask the agency to support that representation, to provide us with the new procedures and processes that is developed to address the findings. Our follow-up review is limited to assessing implementation status. We don't explore new issues or revisit others that aren't related to the recommendations. Now, I hope that what I've described gives you a better understanding of our audit process. The one thing that I can't put on a slide, in fact, it's the most significant thing, is our staff. It's our analysts. Audit work isn't easy. And it's not for everyone. Of course, over the course of an audit, our analysts take a deep dive into the agency, like I was trying to describe, looking at its work, and they become subject matter experts, all in a matter of a few months. And while they're collecting and digesting facts and figures and transcripts, they also must sort through and analyze that collected material to determine what aligns with our objectives and contributes to an audit finding. Much of what they look at doesn't. Analysts have to be both a quick study and a deep thinker. They have to have professional skepticism. They must be able to ask tough questions. They need to have professional judgment. We don't report only facts. We must be able to analyze those facts, to use our professional judgment to connect those factual dots based on objective criteria. That's the value that we bring, to be able to provide an independent, unbiased, objective assessment of a state program that the legislature created and funded, to ensure that the program is operating as the legislature intended, achieving its purpose, and doing so effectively, efficiently, and ethically. In short, we hold agencies accountable. We have a great group, and I'm very proud of our staff and proud of our work. And I look forward to this opportunity to discuss our audit of Dlnr's Special Ed and Development Fund. As I said earlier, we did our job and we did it well. I'm going to jump in now and talk about our audit. The audit, like I mentioned at the beginning, was directed by the legislature in 2017. Through the audit process that I described, we developed audit objectives. And these objectives for this audit were to evaluate Dlnr's processes related to land management of its leases and permits, to evaluate Dlnr's accounting and reporting relating to its lease and RP rent collection, that's revocable permits, to determine the propriety of SLDF expenditures, including transfers to other Dlnr programs, and to make recommendations as appropriate. And this is a summary of what we found. Without a strategic plan for its public lands, the land division's management of leases and revocable permits defaults to maintaining the status quo rather than exploring higher and better use. The lack of complete and coherent policies and procedures prevents the land division from adequately managing leases and revocable permits. And the lack of transparency and accountability hinders the administration of the Special Land and Development Fund. Now, I'm going to discuss each of these findings in a little more detail. But before I do that, I think it's important to remind the committee that the audit period for our review, as directed in Act 209, was July 1, 2015 to June 30, 2017. And perhaps more importantly, we issued this report over 2 years ago. So it is possible that the conditions have changed since our audit, and we have done nothing more than with respect to this audit since that time. So the committee should consider that things may be different today versus when we performed our work. I do note that we are on the cusp of initiating our active follow-up review of the department's implementation of the audit recommendations. But for this committee's work, we likely would have started our follow-up review early next year. But at this point, we'll look to see what the committee does before we initiate that follow-up. Now, going and talking about our findings, I think it makes sense to talk about finding 1 and finding 2 together. You know, many of the aspects of those 2 findings overlap. Our first finding is that without a strategic plan for its public lands, the land division's management of those leases and revocable permits defaults to maintaining the status quo rather than exploring higher and better use. Our second finding was lack of complete and coherent policies and procedures prevents the land division from adequately managing its leases and revocable permits. Now, with respect to the land division's leases, we looked at the income generating properties, the industrial and commercial leases. We assessed the land division's processes and its management of those leases or those kind of leases, which included the process to determine whether to extend leases. We also assessed the land division's processes for managing its revocable permits. Now, what were the conditions that existed when we performed our field work, which are the basis for the audit findings? Well, the land division did not have a strategic plan or a long-range plan for its land holdings, either for leases or for RPs. The land division had 70 ground leases in the KIA area near Hilo International Airport. Many of those leases were awarded in the early 1960s in the aftermath of the 1960 tsunami that destroyed much of downtown Hilo. Those leases, like the division's other ground leases, provide that the lessee owns the improvements to the property during the term of the lease, but that ownership of the improvements, including the buildings and the other structures on the property, reverts to the state without compensation when the lease ends. Lessees are also responsible for maintaining the improvements during the term of the lease. So about 1/3 of those leases were set to expire in 2016. Now, what the board did is they granted 10-year extensions to the first lease that came up that requested an extension, and then for every other subsequent request for an extension. The land division did not consider adding a premium to the KIE lease extensions. The improvements proposed by lessees to support their extension requests included gutter repairs, roof repairs, replacement of skylights, painting, repairing termite damage and deteriorated sections of the building, replacing a fuel distribution pump. So those are the conditions that we noted with respect to KIA. Regarding the Sand Island Business Association, or SIBA, SIBA manages a 73-acre, 111-lot Sand Island Industrial Park under a 55-year master lease with Dlnr. The SIBA lease is the land division's largest single revenue generator, accounting for about 50% of the Special Land and Development Fund's revenue. The master lease included discounted rents for the first 25 years from 1992 through 2027. I don't think that's correct, 2017. Excuse me for that. To allow SIBA to recover the costs of infrastructure improvements. Now, starting in the 26th year, which was 2017, the master lease provides that the fair market base rent for the industrial park will be determined by appraisal, and that the rent will be redetermined every 10 years thereafter. Now, SIBA requested an early appraisal and rent redetermination, claiming that its tenants needed to obtain financing. Although the land division determined there was no evidence that long-term real estate secured financing was required by a substantial number of SIBA tenants, Dlnr agreed to push up the rent redetermination for the base rent due from July 1, 2017 to June 30, 2027. SEBA then requested that the base rent be redetermined for an additional 30 years from July 1, 2027 to June 30, 2057, which is actually 10 years beyond the term of the lease. In its 2013 submittal to the board, the Land Division wrote, and I quote, "Conducting the reopening early was not the department's preference because it puts the state at risk if the real estate market improves in a manner not anticipated in the appraisal. However, an appraisal was completed in 2015 for the 30 years from July 1, 2017, which SEBA subsequently agreed to." Now, what were the conditions we saw with respect to revocable permits? In 2016, the Land Division collected $2 million in revenue from approximately 340 RPs, which was about 10% of the division's total revenue. Now, we reviewed 113 RP files as of June 30, 2017, 31 on Oahu, 29 on Hawaii Island, 30 on Kauai, and 23 on Maui. Now, the ages of the RPs that we reviewed ranged from 1 to 51 years. Now, out of our sample, only 5 of the 113 RPs had rent increases since their inception. In 2016, the division retained CBRE to determine the value and fair market rent for 113 RPs, not the same 113 that we reviewed. Based on CBRE's report issued in January 2018, the rent paid by the vast majority of the RPs it appraised were below fair market rates and some significantly below. For example, in 2017, a tenant paid $1,319.40 per year, or $21.56 per acre, for a 61.2 acre agricultural property on Kauai. CBRE appraised the annual fair market rent to be $225 per acre, or $13,770 per year, a difference of over 1,000%. CBRE appraised a 45 acre parcel on Hawaii Island that the tenant was using for a concrete plant, paying $231,300 per year. CBRE estimated the fair market rent was $506,250, a difference of 219%. Now, of the 113 parcels reviewed by CBRE, CBRE found the Land Division's rents lagged far behind the market rate. The rent for those 113 parcels was $1.3 million versus $2.2 million that CBRE believed was the fair market rent, a difference of $838,000 per year. And that review by CBRE included only about 1/3 of the division's RPs and did not include some of the more significant ones, like the Hilton Hawaiian Village Pier. Now, as a result of the CBRE report, the Land Division requested the board approve increases of 3% for RPs not appraised by CBRE, 3% increases for RPs that CBRE determined were less than 10% below fair market rate, and for RPs with rents that CBRE found were well below fair market rates, that is, rents that were 10% or more below fair market rent. The Land Division capped the rent adjustments to a maximum increase of 10% per year. Now, for some of these RPs, the difference between current and the fair market rent is so substantial that it's likely or unlikely that the 10% annual increase will close that gap in the near or the distant future. Now, we also found that the Land Division doesn't perform some of the basic core lease management functions. It doesn't reconcile cash receipts that are recorded in SLIMS, which is the Land Division's database, with the state's financial accounting system. Dlnr doesn't have documented controls to ensure that it is collecting the percentage rent due under lease agreements. The Land Division does not have the capability to track delinquent accounts beyond 60 days. The Land Division's accounting system reflected at the end of June 2017, the accounts receivable totaled $7.3 million, with $2.1 million or 29% of the total balance being over 60 days old. And the department determined that $1.6 million of the delinquent amounts receivable were uncollectible due to a history of non-payment, bankruptcy, or the tenant being out of business. We discovered that the Land Division does not conduct regular annual inspections of its leased properties to ensure that lessees are adequately maintaining improvements. and complying with other lease terms. Inspections are important to also ensure the property is being used for the purpose for which it was leased and no unauthorized activities are taking place, that no unapproved subleasing is occurring. Now, out of the 1,300 leases and 300 RPs in its inventory, the Land Division's records indicated that it was inspecting on average 43 leases and 40 RPs during the period 2015 to 2017. Of the 5 leases that were terminated during that period, the files reflected that the division's land agents did not conduct a closeout inspection on any of those leases. The closeout inspection is important. It's intended to look for issues such as hazardous materials on the property, as well as unauthorized dismantling or removal of improvements that revert to the state. Now, why does this matter? What's the big deal if the department granted the 10-year lease extensions to the KIA lessees instead of allowing the leases to expire? So what's the big deal that the department didn't consider premiums to the lease extensions? So what if the department agreed to rent redeterminations for the SEBA master lease through 2057? Why does it matter that the RPs are substantially below market rate? The succinct answer to all of those questions is that the Land Division is not maximizing the revenue from the use of state lands. As I mentioned previously, the lease and RP revenues constitute a significant percentage, the majority of the Special Land and Development Fund's revenues. And that fund is the sole funding source for the Land Division and Dlnr's Office of Conservation and Coastal Lands. The fund also supports the Commission on Water Resource Management, Division of State Parks, and the Division of Forestry and Wildlife. The statute also allows excess monies in the statute or in the fund to be transferred to the state general fund. So I guess the $64,000 question is, how much revenue is the state losing? Well, we don't know the answer to that question, but we do know that it's likely substantial. The lease rent is by statute based on the appraised fair market rent. While we didn't have the KIA properties appraised, we attempted to estimate the potential revenue that the department could have realized if it had let the KIA leases expire and issued new space leases. As an aside, it's not just our opinion that Dlnr could increase its rent revenue from KIA. In late 2014, Dlnr commissioned an urban planning and project management consultant to assess market conditions for industrial properties in Hilo and the KIA areas and analyze future demand for industrial, commercial, and mixed industrial commercial uses. The consultant concluded that the reissuance of leases, that is, new leases, would create opportunities and incentives for new investment in the area and strengthen KIA's competitive position among industrial parks in East Hawaii. Now, to estimate the amount of lost revenue, and it's just an estimate, we took the square footage of the buildings and other improvements for each of the 16 KIA properties that were given lease extensions from the Hawaii County real property tax records. And then we multiplied that by the commercial space lease rent for Hilo, according to CBRE Hawaii Research, which at the time was 84 cents per square foot. For just the 16 properties, we estimated the annual lost revenue opportunity to the state to be about $1.637 million. In our report, we also highlighted one of the KIA leases that the board extended. Now, 69 Railroad LLC leased a 4.5 acre lot in KIA, paying the state annual lease rent of $74,500. 69 Railroad was subleasing the entire property, was not using any of the property for its own operations, and was receiving approximately $300,000 in sublease revenue. In 2013, the Land Division recommended approval of a 10-year lease extension. The lessee challenged the state's appraisal of the fair market rent for the ground lease and ultimately agreed on an annual lease rent of $127,384. Now, although the agreed upon rent was more than the prior rent, Dlnr is still quote, paying 69 Railroad nearly $180,000 to manage the property. In other words, if the board had allowed the lease to expire and leased the space to 69 Railroad sublessees, the state would realize an additional $180,000 in lease rent. Now, the RP rents are significantly below fair market rent for the types of these properties. Dlnr collected about $2 million from its RP. Now, this is a picture or a graph or picture of the RPs on the different islands and the amount of revenue that were being generated by the RPs on the different islands. Now, CBRE reviewed 113 of the RPs that were selected by the Land Division and determined that the difference between the 2017 rent and the appraised fair market value was $837,728. And as noted above, not only did CRE appraise only a fraction of the total RPs, some of the more significant RPs were not included by the Land Division in CBRE's scope of review, like the Hilton Hawaiian Village Pier, which is the highest income producing RP. Now, I almost forgot to mention the CEBA rent redetermination. Instead of redetermining the rent every 10 years, starting from 2017, as provided in the master lease, Dlnr agreed to CEBA's request to set the rent for the next 30 years through 2057. Now, although that rent is based on the appraised fair market value, appraisers, they can't predict the future. Market conditions change. The every 10-year rent redetermination clause is really intended to protect the state from those changing market conditions that can drive up the value of the land. Today's real estate market probably highlights this issue. I don't know whether the commercial property market has increased, but I've read many articles that the residential single-family homes on Oahu now average $1 million. If the commercial property market has similarly increased, the rent for any of the future periods that was determined based on an appraisal done in 2015 is likely stale and inaccurate. In other words, the state is not getting what it should be getting in those future years. Now, how did these problems occur? What's causing them? The Land Division has no strategic plan for the long-range management of its public lands. No asset management plan to identify and fulfill its obligations and goals related to the administration of its lands. No business plan. Without any plan, without the expertise, the Land Division does not have the ability to do anything but maintain the status quo, meaning it must extend leases, losing significant revenue opportunities. Now, managing commercial and industrial lands, it's complicated. It requires planning. It requires that portion of the Land Division's responsibility to be run like a business. But the Land Division is not operating like a business. The status quo is not sufficient. The department is not fulfilling its mission. It is wasting public assets by simply maintaining the status quo and maximizing the income from its income-generating properties. In 2012, when Dlnr considered the first lease extension, the Land Division recommended rejecting the lease extension because the Land Division considered the property to be an underperforming asset. The Land Division suggested consolidating that parcel with 8 others whose leases were set to expire in early 2016, and then subdividing the parcels into 2 or 3 larger lots. So now in its submission to the Land Board, the Land Division noted that because the improvements revert back to the state upon expiration of the lease, the state would likely generate higher lease rents for improved land rather than extending the ground leases for another 10 years, which the Land Division said would likely, and I quote, perpetuate the underperformance of the land and the adjoining lots for the same period. However, the Land Board, it granted the 10-year extensions. Now, the former board chair told us that the Land Division did not have the capacity to implement the strategy. He said, and as well as the Land Division administrator, they both separately told us that the division does not have and did not have the expertise to serve as a property manager. But the Land Division or the department has not attempted to develop that expertise. Now, the land division and the department had ample opportunity to plan for the inevitable or the eventuality, the expiration of the KIA leases starting in 2016, and to consider the reclassification, consolidation, and redevelopment of those properties, but it didn't. Without a plan, without the expertise to make important business-type decisions, it was forced to resort to the status quo. Now, the land division has defended the board's lease extensions by pointing to Act 207, which was passed by the legislature in 2011, which authorizes the board to extend the KIE leases to a maximum of 16 years. In other words, to give 10-year lease extensions to the original 55-year leases under certain conditions, specifically if the extensions are necessary to qualify for mortgage lending or to amortize the cost of self-financed improvements to the property. Now, as noted earlier, some examples of the substantial of those improvements proposed by lessees to support their extension requests include roof and gutter repairs, replacement of skylights, painting, repairing termite damage and deteriorated sections of a building, replacing a fuel distribution pump. Now, those sound more like routine maintenance. And in the case of the fuel pump, business equipment, not building improvements. And the cost of some of those improvements that were offered to support the extension requests range from $30,000 to as little as $12,000. However, the land division does not have policies and procedures to guide its review of lease extension requests, including what constitutes substantial improvement versus routine maintenance. The land division also has no procedures or other guidance for land agents to document and review completion of the promised improvements that were the justification for lease extension requests, and to verify the required cost receipts as required by law. Now, the land division's limited oversight of its RP is likely also the result of a lack of any strategic plan, any business plan as to what the department intends with respect to those lands and how the department can generate fair market rent. The department told us it wasn't authorized to take certain steps that would increase rent revenues for its lessees. For instance, when the lease rent, when the leases were extended, there was an opportunity to add premiums to that to account for the fact that there were the reversionary interest to the state was being delayed or deferred. Now, the Division of Boating and Ocean Recreation commissioned a report, Marketing Practices for Lease Extensions, which examined private sector lease extension practices that including charging a premium for extending ground leases in exchange for foregoing the reversionary interest. The lease rent for the improved properties likely would be higher than the lease rent for the unimproved properties, which is what the original leases are based on. Since the lessor is giving up the flexibility in the future use of the property, it can expect to be compensated. Now, Dlnr told us that the law doesn't allow it to add a premium for extending ground leases in exchange for foregoing reversionary interest. Dlnr said the state procurement code doesn't authorize a percentage payment to hire a private organization to assist in leasing and managing its improved properties. But we are unaware of any efforts that the department has made to amend the statute to address those concerns. Well, perhaps this committee and the work this committee is doing is actually a gift horse to the department. Hopefully Dlnr will have a discussion with the committee and make suggestions to the committee about amendments to the statute that it may need to better manage its lands. Now I'm going to move to the third finding. The Special Land and Development Fund holds proceeds from the sale of public lands, mineral and water rights, rents from leases, licenses, and permits, fees, fines, and other administrative charges, a portion of the highway fuel tax, monies from the commercial use of the public trails, and a portion of the transient accommodation tax revenues. It funds the management, operations, and maintenance of all lands under the control of the board, including the operating budget of the Land Division and the Office of Conservation in Coastal Lands. We found that the Land Division's administration of the Special Land and Development Fund is poor. The division doesn't accurately account for the monies in the fund. The SLDF is comprised of 25 accounts, which include the parent account, which is S-316, and 24 subaccounts. Now, as you can see from the chart, some of the subaccounts hold funds that appear to support other divisions. Others appear to be for specific land acquisition. For instance, S-353 appears to be a subaccount that holds funding for the Division of Forestry and Wildlife. S-404 appears to be a subaccount holding funding relating to the acquisition of land in Palolo. All the subaccounts, however, are under the umbrella of the SLDF parent account, S-316. Now, why does it matter? The Special Land and Development Fund was created by the legislature to hold and account for the revenues that are earmarked for specific purposes. Now, because the funding for the SLDF and other special funds is outside of the general fund, the legislature has much less visibility into amounts in the special funds. Special funds are much less transparent because they are removed from the legislature's normal budget and appropriation process. Now, without an accurate understanding of the special fund, the Land Division cannot account for and report the total fund balance to the legislature. The legislature requires Dlnr and every other department to annually report their respective non-general funds 20 days before each legislative session. Now, that report is intended to provide the legislature with important fiscal information about the fund's revenues, expenditures, and fund balances. But because Dlnr and the Land Division's understanding the Special Land and Development Fund is incorrect, Dlnr did not include 15 subaccounts in its annual non-general fund reports to the legislature in 2018. Now, that resulted in the SLDF's cash balances being understated by $1.5 million. We also found subaccounts holding more than $1.5 million in the SLDF had been idle for at least 5 years. Now, those funds are held in the 400 series SLDF subaccounts, which Dlnr told us were established to fund various capital improvement projects. It's unclear whether those projects are still planned, have been completed, or were abandoned. Because of Dlnr and Land Division's misunderstanding of the SLDF subaccounts, Dlnr reports transfers out of the parent account, but not a corresponding transfer into a SLDF subaccount, creating the appearance that the SLDF's balance of available cash was reduced by the amount of the transfer. That's not accurate. More importantly, the transferred funds are not reported to the legislature. Now, in addition, we found that Dlnr had transferred over $1.3 million in FY 2015 and over $2.4 million in FY 2017 from the SLDF to other Dlnr special funds, that is, to accounts that are outside of the SLDF. Now, under Hawaii law, special funds must be self-sustaining. If another special fund's revenues are insufficient to support the intended program or programs, that fund should be closed and the program should be funded through general funds. Now, why did this problem occur? Now, the Land Division believes the SLDF consists of only two accounts, one parent account and one subaccount, and that's just not correct. We review the department's special funds once every 5 years. Now, we just happened to review Dlnr's special funds, including the SLDF, just a few months before we issued the SLDF audit. In that report, we rolled up all the subaccounts, meaning we added all the subaccount balances to the primary account to accurately report the financial data for the SLDF. We have also followed a similar procedure that I described when we perform our fund reviews, meaning that we meet with the department and we include the department's written comments in the report. So in our fund review of the department's, the Dlnr special funds, Dlnr apparently understood that the SLDF included 24 subaccounts because Dlnr did not raise any question or objections about our report, about the subaccounts during any of our meetings or in its written comments. Now, in our performance audit, we also include recommendations. We include recommendations in all of our reports, and this report of the SLDF was no different. I'm not going to read the recommendations. But I think it's very important to understand what the recommendations represent. So the recommendations are our suggestions, our recommendations as to how the department can address what we believe are the causes of the problems that we've identified. They are our suggestions, but they are not the only way to address the audit findings. That is why I suggest it is very important for an auditee and the committee, frankly, to focus on the audit findings. That is what we determined is not working well based on the competent, sufficient evidence that we gathered. We have identified issues with the department's management of its lands. Those are the audit findings. The department may have a different approach to addressing those findings, and that's fine. Our goal is to help the department improve its management of its lands. That's our goal. That's what my office is. That's our purpose of our office. Now, I mentioned at the beginning in describing our audit process that the department can provide written comments that we include in the report. Now, Dlnr's comments are at page 54 of the report. We provide our response to those comments at page 48 of the report. Now, I explained that we provide the draft report to the agency and have an exit conference to discuss any issues that the department has with the draft. We followed that procedure in this audit, as we do with every audit. We provided the draft to Dlnr and we had an exit conference. However, Dlnr did not avail itself to the process. Dlnr did not raise concerns about the report during the exit conference. Instead, it waited to raise those concerns in its written comments, apparently electing not to have that discussion with us. No. In any event, we didn't find Dlnr's comments to be meaningful, and I suggest that the committee take a look at our response to Dlnr's comments. I also suggest, as the committee reads the report, Dlnr's response, and has discussion with Dlnr tomorrow and in the future, that the committee filter out the noise, some of that outrage that Dlnr has expressed with respect to the audit findings, and examine more closely Dlnr's responses. More specifically, look at what Dlnr is not saying. When Dlnr touts the increase in SLDF revenues, in fact, I think Dlnr thinks it should be congratulated because it has increased the revenues to the Special Land and Development Fund. But Dlnr is not saying that that increase is because, or even partially because, it has made efforts to receive fair market rent for its income properties. It is not saying that it is maximizing the return on its income properties. And as we explained in our response to Dlnr's comments, the increase in SLDF revenues that Dlnr is so proud of is because the lease rents being paid by SEBA, which accounts for about half of SLDF's revenues, increased. The rent increase represented the first time that SEBA tenants paid market rent. The previous 25 years' rent had been discounted. In addition, about 2.5 million of the increase of 3.5 million in FY 2017 was because of the legislature's appropriation of the TAT to the SLDF. Similarly, Dlnr is not saying that it is addressing the accounts receivable problem. That is, it is not saying that it's making efforts to collect the millions of dollars in outstanding rent, some of which is over 60 days delinquent. No. Dlnr tries to point fingers elsewhere. It's claiming that other state agencies, specifically, and they provide a whole list of them, Department of Agriculture, ADC, HPHA, HHFDC, DOT Harbors, DOT Airports, NELHA, HTDC, and DOE have comparable or comparable delinquency rates. And therefore, Dlnr says that the criticism lacks support and is unwarranted. They're not saying they're making efforts. They're not saying they're improving their collection efforts. And I want to comment that we don't audit those agencies, or we didn't audit those agencies. And whether those agencies have similar problems as the Land Division, we sincerely hope that they do not, but it doesn't excuse or otherwise justify the Land Division's indifference to the collection of the rent that's due. I strongly urge the committee to assess the objections and concerns. I don't see that Dlnr is disputing the conditions that we reported, or that is the basis for our findings. In other words, the facts. Dlnr doesn't have a strategic plan, doesn't have a business plan, doesn't have another plan or another type of plan concerning the management of its income producing land, specifically the commercial and industrial properties. Dlnr granted lease extensions rather than allowing the leases to expire and consolidate lands or consolidate those leases. The consultant's report made similar conclusions. Dlnr agreed to rent redetermination for the SEBA master lease all the way through 2057. And with respect to the RPs, that CBRE found the rent for the vast majority of them were well below fair market rent. The difference, what Dlnr disagrees with, is that the land division has a responsibility to maximize revenue from those income lands. A number of people, from the Dlnr members to the land administrator, have told us it's better to have a good tenant than to receive fair market rent. We disagree. And we believe it's the board, the department, and the division's duty to maximize revenues from those revenue or income lands. Our audit focused on the land division's management, not management of the revenue or income properties. We didn't look at all of the lands in Dlnr's portfolio. Dlnr manages ag lands, it manages other lands that may be used by the state to promote other types of initiatives like high tech or renewable energy. We're not saying that Dlnr should receive even fair market rent for those properties. However, Dlnr has a duty to maximize the revenue from its commercial and industrial properties, those it deemed to be revenue producing. That duty flows from the public trust obligations that Dlnr has. Moreover, the board cannot provide unwarranted advantages, unwarranted benefits to selected groups, namely longtime lessees, by extending the leases. As a matter of practice, Dlnr deprives others from the opportunity to lease the property, other members of the public, other taxpayers, to relocate to locate their business on state lands. And as importantly, by charging below market rent, Dlnr is in essence paying or subsidizing those lessees the difference between the fair market rent and the below market rent that they are paying. As I said earlier, managing state lands, managing lands is complicated and requires certain expertise. It's a business operation, but Dlnr doesn't operate like a business. It doesn't have the personnel that it needs to do that. This, frankly, is not the way government does business, and it's not the way anyone should be doing business. The land division doesn't think it needs a plan, claiming that Chapter 171 is its Bible. That position is misplaced. The statute is not a strategic plan. It's not a business plan. It's not any kind of plan. It doesn't provide any guidance or direction as to how the land division can maximize the revenue from its revenue generating lands, how it should manage those lands. When Dlnr claims that it was following Chapter 171 when it approved the KIA lease extensions, we want to be clear. We're not saying that Dlnr did anything illegal. We're not saying that they violated Chapter 171, but the statute sets the floor. When the legislature amended the law to allow the board to extend the leases in KIA for up to 65 years, it gave the department another tool in its belt. However, the law clearly does not mandate. It doesn't require the department to extend the leases. It's permissive. It allows the department to do so under certain conditions. But that amendment doesn't relieve or didn't relieve the department of its other responsibilities, duties that flow from the public land trust and other responsibilities that come with managing the state's public lands. I started out by saying that we did a good job, and we did. We audited the land division's management of its income producing lands, including its RPs. We audited the land division's accounting of the SLDF. We made findings that are based on sufficient and competent audit evidence, but we have no further powers or responsibilities. What I mean is that compelling the department to address the audit findings, to fix things, it's beyond our authority. With the issuance of the report, we have passed the baton to Dlnr to address the audit findings, to make its processes better, to become more transparent and accountable. And that the baton is also passed to you folks, to the legislature. The legislature has the power and the authority to compel action by the department, which I assume is the purpose of this committee's investigation into the department's implementation of its recommendations. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to all of you. If you have questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you, Auditor. If you can unshare your screen. Members, we've been listening to Mr. Kondo's presentation for about 45 minutes. So I'm going to take a recess, but we will return with questions. So we'll take a 5-minute recess. Please tune back in at around 10:17. Thank you. We're in recess. reconvening our committee hearing on Monday, September 13th. We have with us Auditor Les Condo, and this is the questioning portion of our hearing today. Mr. Kondo, I see you here on the screen. And just to remind you, you are under oath. And our first question will be from Chair Tarnas. Chair Tarnas, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you very much, Mr. Kondo, for your presentation today and for the audit. You know, as a legislator and policy analyst, I'm interested in the policy basis of your audit's conclusions and your analysis. You know, that's the statutory and constitutional language, or perhaps your interpretation of legislative intent. So what I'm interested in is, you know, in the SLDF audit, what's the statutory or constitutional basis for your analysis and conclusions that Dlnr failed to maximize revenues in setting lease rents or extending leases, or they over-rely on lease extensions at discounted lease rents to pay for leasehold improvements? What is the statutory basis for your conclusions that they have failed to do these things?
I think it may be bigger than that. It may be a constitutional basis. I think there's the Public Land Trust, which is referred to in Chapter 171 as well, and the responsibility to administer the public land trust in the best interest of the general public, as well as for very specific purposes that are spelled out in both the Constitution as well as in Chapter 171. I think also that there is a general responsibility for all state agencies to operate effectively and efficiently, and to consider all different factors in for instance, in their lease extensions, not only their maximum revenue, but they need to consider other types of factors that may affect the ability or the decision to extend leases or to give leases. For instance, they have to assess, or they should assess, whether or not the property is being used for its best use, or things like that. And I give you a different example. And I think that that leasing, the lease function or the land management function, like I mentioned throughout my presentation, in my opinion, or in our opinion, it's a business function. It's something that is done, that it's not a normal or a routine government function, but it needs to operate more like a business. And I give you a different analogy. If I look at the Hawaii Convention Center, or look at Aloha Stadium, or at least Aloha Stadium a few years ago, I don't think that there is any dispute that the committee or any other legislator would have that there's a responsibility to get fair market value, fair market rent for those facilities. If Bruno Mars came and did 4 shows at Aloha Stadium and was going to make $1 million a show, and the Aloha Stadium Authority allowed Bruno Mars to lease the stadium for $1 a show, I don't think that that issue or that amount would be considered to be reasonable. So I'm not sure if I have answered your question fully, but I certainly think that there are many different bases for the conclusion that there is a responsibility by Dlnr, the land division, the board, to get fair market rent. In fact, if you look at the statute, Chapter 171, all of the leases are based upon fair market appraisals that establish fair market rent. So
thank you, Auditor. Chair, do you have a follow-up?
Just, yeah, brief follow-up.
Sure.
I'm interested in trying to figure out how to finance leasehold improvements on property. And other part of the audit, you were suggesting that the state should make these infrastructure investments and own it, as opposed to giving discounted rates to lessee to build the leasehold improvements. What was your analysis that drove you to that conclusion, that it'd be better for the state to actually do the infrastructure improvements and own it, as opposed to giving discounted rates to the lessee?
I'm sorry if that was the impression that I gave you. I don't think I said that.
Okay. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you. Minority Leader Okimoto, do you have any questions you'd like to ask?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Majority Leader. Thank you, Mr. Condo. First question regarding the Dlnr staff capabilities. Do you think this may be an issue of the staff capabilities in Dlnr, meaning they need to hire appropriate staff capable of understanding the law and implementing the needed changes? Or is this, in your opinion, a reflection of legal loopholes that require a legislative solution versus a Dlnr management solution?
I think, like I was saying in the presentation, I think the challenge is there's no plan. So without a plan, what came about is that the leases at KIA, they came up for extension. They were going to expire in 2016 or start expiring in 2016. And without a plan as to what they could do with those leases, they didn't build the bench. They didn't build the expertise in the land division or in the department more broadly to be able to do business differently, to be able to take over those properties, consolidate them like land division itself recommended, consolidate those properties and earn more revenue by leasing it out as improved properties rather than just vacant ground leases. So I think I'm answering your question. I think it's both. They need to develop a bench to plan so that they know how they're going to operate and manage their business. So they build that expertise in the division, or they contract for that expertise outside of the division through a private entity, for instance, private land management company, private leasing company, an organization that does this, for profit. If that's what they need to do, they need to do that. In terms of statutory changes, I know the department has said there are certain things that we talked about with them in the report that they said they're not able to do. One was to add a premium when they renewed or extended the leases. Another one was they didn't think the state procurement code allowed them or allows them to hire a leasing manager or leasing agent, because it's their understanding that leasing agents work on a percentage rent or percentage basis, percentage of the lease rent. And they didn't think the state procurement code allowed them to procure that type of service based upon that kind of compensation model. So if that's true, then I would suggest that there would be a legislative change that's necessary if the legislature felt that that was another tool that was important for the department to have in its tool belt.
Okay, thank you. I had one more question, if that's okay.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
So regarding the rents that we've been discussing,
the what? I'm sorry. The what?
I'm sorry. The rents. We were talking about rents and leases.
Rents.
Having
rent.
Have the potential ramifications of increasing the rents been studied? It's well known here in Hawaii that real estate in our state brings a premium price tag. So I'm wondering if Dlnr hasn't pursued an aggressive policy in increasing rents because maybe it'll affect those on the ground, small businesses, renters more significantly than the bigger businesses. Is that something that's been considered, or have those ramifications been considered or thought about?
I mean, I think that question is better directed at Dlnr. I mean, that wasn't something, I'm not aware of any study that they've done or anything else. And certainly it wasn't presented to us during the course of our audit if that was something that they thought justified their business as usual, just extending the lease rents and not trying to generate more revenue from those properties. Thank
you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Minority Leader. Next, we have Chair Kobayashi.
Thank you, Chair. My question concerns really the process that you've done to come up with your findings and to follow up on them. So, your audit report comes up with a number of what I would consider truly significant issues regarding the agencies. We're also provided with their responses to your audit findings, which I think is pretty clear did not in the least address any of your findings substantively. And that's really the end of what I've seen. Did you have an opportunity, or don't you think it's your responsibility to address their responses? I mean, I guess, is there some thought that this is a kind of never ending back and forth, or is it just procedure that you come out with your findings and then they answer it, and no matter what their answer happens to be, that's the end of the process? Or I would think you would follow up on those because it begs obvious questions.
I mentioned, Rep, that we do put our response to their comments. We do publish that. It is part of the audit report where we try to address their comments. And like I mentioned during my presentation, we didn't think any of those comments had much legs to stand on. And like I was trying to explain to the committee that there's a lot of noise there. But if you look to what actually we found, the basis for our findings, Dlnr is not disputing any of that. Dlnr is just raising a lot of other issues that to me are just red herrings. The fact that other divisions or departments may not be collecting all the rent that's owed to them. The fact that the SLDF has increased, the revenues have increased. Those may be facts, but it doesn't address the findings themselves. If you're asking me if we're going to follow up, the answer is in our process, the answer is yes, we will follow up on our audit recommendations or the implementation of them. If they just disagree and decide they don't want to implement any of them because they don't agree with any of the findings, then we will report that. But like I also said at the very end, we don't have any enforcement tool or any other tools in our belt. We do the audit, we follow up and report what the agency has done to implement recommendations, and we hope that the legislature reads our reports, and if the legislature feels it's appropriate to compel or question the agency as to why they haven't taken certain action, then that ball is in the legislature's court.
So, that's consistent with what my understanding is. Now, I look at what we're currently doing. So you've come out today and recapped really what the significance of your findings were. Then we'll hear from the agency, the target investigation, as to their responses, again, to your audit findings. And presumably they'll talk about, hopefully, some remedies that they've done since the audit to address some of these things. But I see the same kind of process where you come out with your findings, you've described that to us today, and they'll come out with their responses to that, whether substantive or not. Is that really the end of it for you, or are you willing to, like we would in any kind of legal proceeding, have a chance to respond to the target agency's responses? It seems like a repeat of what we did before to have them go last.
I'm happy if the committee wants to hear our thoughts as to whatever Dlnr may say in response to the audit findings. I'm happy to provide our response to those. I think if I understand your question, I think that with this process, the committee is attempting to, quote, hold the department's feet to the fire, so to speak, to see what the department has done to address the audit findings. And, we haven't done any more work since we issued the audit with respect to what Dlnr is doing or what they've done to address the findings, if anything. So any information that they provide you would be new to me, so I wouldn't have the ability to respond meaningfully because we haven't assessed that. We don't really know fully whatever may be described to you. And I think, if I could just comment, I think that's the difference.
Sorry, excuse me. Can we move on? We'll come back to more questioning. And if there is further questioning on the follow-up area, which I think there will be, Auditor Kondo, we will come back to that. But next up, Rep Yamashita.
Yeah, I don't have anything at this time, Chair.
Okay, thank you. So next up is Rep Peruso.
Aloha, I have a couple questions. The first one is around the master strategic plan, and you mentioned a couple of options, but I was wondering if, I was wondering if you had any indications of, or if you had any examples from other agencies that of a good, solid, powerful master strategic plan, because I think we see that same issue with ADC. So are there any good examples that you can point us toward?
I guess the simple answer is no. I mean, that's not within the scope of our audit.
Right, I understand that.
But I do think that there was draft plans, asset management plan, asset portfolio plan that had been prepared, but a number of years ago, but not adopted by the division. Mm-hmm. So, better than what they have for sure. But if you're asking me, because they don't have anything, but if you're asking me if I have other examples for them to look at and model against or model, I don't.
Okay, Russo, do you have another question?
I do. So, and this is a different line of questioning, and it also did not fall within the purview of your audit, but I am wondering about your thoughts, because you do talk about this issue with the expiry of the 65-year leases. And I think that's an important problem that we're seeing across different portfolios. So with the military lands in particular in my district, it's been a source of conflict. So I'm wondering, do you think the Dlnr, and I don't think those lands fall under SLDF, although I could be wrong, I don't think so. Do you think that that Dlnr should adopt a strategy for dealing with the expiration of these 65-year leases that is even-handed, so it applies in all circumstances for all of these 65-year leases?
I don't have an answer for that, Representative, because we didn't look at the leases that you're describing, so I'm not really familiar with them.
Well, what about for you, the leases that are within this analysis?
The leases that we looked at, those and the RPs for that matter, which are basically day-to-day, month-to-month type of leases. That was our concern, is that there is no plan, there is no strategy. So, like I keep talking about the KIA leases, when they came up for expiration, when they were about to expire, and the lessees came for an extension without a plan as to what the department could do with those leases or those lands, it was status quo. In other words, they were forced, in essence, to just extend the leases for another 10 years.
Right.
So yes, there should be a plan. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Up next for questioning, Chair Hashem.
Yeah, I have one question. Auditor Condo, did you come across any fraudulent issues? Like, you're making the assumption is that it was a lack of competence on Dlnr's part that the leases are low. Maybe was there any sign that the leases were intentionally low?
A couple comments. The answer to your first question is no. We didn't find any fraud. We don't look for fraud. If we come about it, we would report it. It's not a forensic audit, but I want to make it clear. We're not saying that they didn't have the competence. I think the bigger takeaway is there's no plan, right? So if you plan for what's going to happen and you have that plan in place, whether you bring in the expertise or whether you hire the expertise, you have a plan as to what you can do with those lands. So that's the bigger takeaway, or the bigger finding, is without those plans, without a plan, strategic plan, long-range plan, asset management plan, business plan, the department is severely hamstrung, or the division.
Chair, any follow-up on that? Any other questions?
No questions for me. That's all.
Okay, thank you. I'll defer to Vice Chair Ichiyama now.
Mr. Kondo, thank you so much for being here today. I wanted to follow up on this last part of your procedures that you mentioned, where after the report is done and comes out, then the auditor will often do follow-ups with the department to see whether or not recommendations were implemented. So our committee has received a copy of a letter from your office to Department of Land and Natural Resources. I believe it was from June 30th, 2020, asking Dlnr to provide an update on the recommendations in the audit. Did Dlnr respond to that letter in 2020?
I would believe so. I don't have a recollection, but I'm assuming they did. We would have followed up if we didn't get a response.
Okay.
And sorry.
Would those responses have been in your report to the legislature for that year? The 2020 annual report to the legislature?
Not in the annual report. We publish a consolidated report that includes all of the departments or agencies that we've audited, their self-reported status of the implementation of audit recommendations. So we published that report around this time. So it would have been published in the fall. I'm trying to look for it as we talk, but that's what that letter is for. It's asking for the department to self-report the implementation status of the audit recommendations. And in the consolidated report, all we do is in essence, copy whatever the department's self-reported status is. The follow-up that I was describing, the active follow-up that we perform is different than that. We don't just rely upon the self-reported implementation status. We actually assess whatever they say they've done to implement. And we assess and we use our judgment to determine whether we agree with that if they say that it's fully implemented or partially implemented.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Auditor. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Okay, Mr. Kondo, I have a question. Actually, some simple questions and then questions about the initiation of this audit. And then we'll cycle back through the list of questioners. There are several questions in different areas that I think we all have. So I do want to make sure I don't monopolize the time. Just a simple question. I just want to confirm that the Yellow Book standards that were applicable to this audit are the December 2011 edition. Is that correct?
Yes.
And then would you say that your office at that time in 2016, I believe was when you were appointed, that you folks adopted and followed all of the best practices in the Yellow Book's December 2011 edition?
Our audits are consistent with what's required in the Yellow Book. Is that what you're asking? And we're peer reviewed every 3 years, and we've had 2 peer reviews since I've been here.
Okay, and so would you have the policies and procedures consistent with the Yellow Book standards for your office that would have been used at the time by the audit team that was in doing this investigation?
Do we have a manual of guides? The answer is yes.
Policy and procedures. Would you be able to provide that to the to this committee for us to examine?
I'm able to.
Okay,
not understanding the purpose, but I'm able to.
Okay, so one of the things that I'm interested in is, again, the initiation phase of this audit. And I do notice that additional work was done specifically for the IUCN. And that was part of the work that was done by KKDLY. How was this identified as an area of focus? Because it was not identified as an area of focus in House Bill 839 Conference Draft 1.
I don't recall specifically, but what we do is when a bill passes or a concurrent resolution passes that requires an audit, we will circle through the legislators who were introducers of the bill or seem to have some interest in the program that we're auditing. In this case, I recall having many discussions with the then land chair, the House land chair, and about Dlnr and his concerns about Dlnr.
And just to refresh your recollection, that would have been Chair Yamani at the time, correct?
That's correct. That's correct. He may have a better recollection than me as to why ICUN, the expenses to ICUN got included.
So I understand that, you would have spoken with Chair Yamani. Would that have been documented pursuant to Yellow Book standards as part of your pre-engagement process?
No, No, I don't think that's pursuant to Yellow Book standards. I don't think Yellow Book requires that.
Okay, and then you said you spoke to legislators. What other legislators did you speak to regarding the process of determining what your scope of the audit would be?
I don't recall. I don't know if we would have circled through other House members or whether we also circled through the Senate land chair. I don't recall.
Okay, but you would certainly, I mean, in fairness, and I defer to the Senate, you would also have talked with and consulted with senators, correct?
I don't recall. I know that Representative Yamane was particularly interested in Dlnr, so we had multiple discussions about maybe not just about the bill, but just about some issues that he had with Dlnr. You know,
Okay.
we have multiple discussions with legislators as they try to decide what they might want to introduce or what bills they may want to amend to have us help them in understanding things about departments and agencies and programs. So we have those all the time. So if you're asking me the specifics, I'm sorry, I don't recall that 3 years ago or 4 years ago.
Okay, just one more question, and I'm going to throw the questions back to Chair Tarnas, and then we'll come back further to more process questions. So I'm not surprised that IUCN was involved, because if you look at the legislative history of this bill, there was that concern with the IUCN. But more importantly, you know, this started off as a procurement audit. And thank you again for your explanation of performance audit, because, you know, certainly that is a procurement audit is not a performance audit. So, but my question is, because you expanded scope to IUCN, there must have been interest in the potential procurement violations that could have occurred. So why didn't you expand your scope to potential procurement violations, as your audit report was very, it suggested some lack of strategic planning, but what about the concerns that were previously surfaced in the legislative history about procurement problems? Can you speak to that, please?
Yeah, we went through the process that I described earlier in my presentation to identify audit objectives. I think I'm glad for the question, Rep, because it really raises a really important point that hopefully all of you folks on the committee can kind of take to heart as you ask for additional audits. When we see bills and concurrent resolutions that ask for an audit, oftentimes that bill or that resolution will say, for instance, audit the Department of Education. And we just don't have the ability, the time, or the manpower to audit the Department of Education. They do so many things. They have so many different functions and branches and activities. So we always will go and attempt to discuss that with the legislators who may have introduced the bill or shown interest in that audit, to strongly encourage them to identify exactly what they want us to audit. You know, the program, the activity, the division, that they really are interested in understanding whether that division, that program, that activity is being performed correctly, you know, efficiently, effectively. Often we get bills that come out of session that just are very general, nevertheless. And at that point, it's left.
Thank you, Auditor. But can you answer my question about why didn't the scope include the procurement activities as that was stated in the very first bill?
I'm trying to, Representative, because at the end of the day, when we got the bill, we felt that after discussions with some legislators, we felt that we were going to go through our planning process that I described and come up with audit objectives, which we did. You know, if the legislature feels like they wanted us to look at something else, we're happy to go back and do another audit. You could introduce that through a bill or a resolution if you think that you have interest in understanding the land division or Dlnr's procurement process. We're happy to go back and do that audit.
Okay, thank you. So again, I just want to reiterate this question because I want to make sure you don't recall. You don't know what other legislators you spoke with about the scope of this audit?
I don't recall.
Okay, thank you. Chair Tarnas, throwing to you. Go ahead.
Thank you. Auditor Condo, I wondered if your recommendation that Dlnr should be considering doing space lease rents instead of just general leases would, to me, mean that the state would need to make improvements to be able to lease out spaces. So you got to actually divvy up and make improvements within your building in order to lease out spaces. So that's what I meant when I was saying earlier that you're recommending that the state really invest in those improvements and they own them, and then they would, I guess, recoup their costs by charging higher space lease rents. What's your analysis that brought you to that conclusion that it'd be good to do space lease rents? Because there's a whole lot more additional costs that the state would have to take on in order to do that.
Representative, I think I'm not communicating very well, and I apologize, because the leases that we were talking about, they're ground leases. In other words, it's just the unimproved land that was being leased 65 years ago or 55 years ago to the lessee. Since that time, the lessees have built improvements. They built buildings and other structures on those properties. And at the end of the lease, as I mentioned, the leases all provide that those improvements revert to the state. So the state of Hawaii, upon expiration of that lease, will own the building and other improvements on those lands. So if you're asking me, does the recommendation require Dlnr to build structures? No, the structures are there, they're built, right? The amount of money that a lessee or lessor, which would be the state in this case, can generate from an improved property is likely more. In other words, it has buildings on it. You don't have to build the building. Is likely more than what the state can generate from vacant land.
Okay, that makes sense. No, that makes sense. So you're not suggesting that we actually make these improvements. You're just saying that we should just let the lease expire, put it out for auction, and basically use the improvements that the former lessee had made, and then we lease out from there. So that's what you're describing.
Yeah, it's no longer a vacant land, a ground lease. It has something on it.
Okay, all right. Yeah, thank you. Back to you, Chair. I'll defer to the next question.
Minority Leader Okimoto.
Thank you, Chair. So Auditor Condo, we've talked a lot about the Dlnr and their management or inability to be managed properly. So it seems from what I understand that there's a lot of inadequacies there. Do you think that it might be beneficial for the legislature to instruct or prudent, I guess, for us to instruct another agency or appoint a commission or committee to oversee their appropriate Dlnr activities based on the audit findings? Because it seems like we mentioned that there's they might benefit from proper oversight or management of this based on your audit findings.
That question is way above my pay grade, legislator, representative. That is a policy call that is much more appropriate for you and your fellow representatives than for me.
Okay, thank you. I did have one more quick one kind of connected to it, and maybe you might have the same response, but I was wondering, you had mentioned the difficulties that Dlnr has had with planning and being having the proper vision in their decision making. So do you think that legal penalties for such failures as the audit has found, would that be another public policy that the legislature should look into, an adjustment to right this ship? Because it seems, for me, astonishing that such a gross mismanagement can be let go without someone being held responsible.
Again, that's a question that is a policy call for you guys to decide.
Thank you.
But we're not suggesting, by the way, real quick, that there's any criminal misconduct or any violation of the statute, because that's what Dlnr says. Chapter 171 is its Bible. We did everything pursuant to Chapter 171. We didn't step out of the boundaries of that chapter of the statute. We don't disagree with that, right? But what Chapter 171 is not a plan. It provides, for some things, it provides the floor. Like it gives the department tools, like I was saying, so that they can extend the lease. They don't have to, but it gives them that option, considering a lot of other factors.
I guess I was wondering, what could we get to the point where there's a plan? You mentioned that there's no plan. They don't have the plans. They don't have the vision. So what do we need to get done to get Dlnr to get to the point where they have this?
You should tell Dlnr they should present a business plan or a strategic plan or a long-range plan. That's one of the recommendations that we made in the report.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Minority Leader. Thank you. Rep. Kobayashi, Chair Kobayashi.
Thank you, Chair. So I just have a question regarding document finding procedures. So we issued a subpoena to the department about requesting certain documents, and some of them were specific, some of them were a little more general in terms of documents related to this. So they responded with a bunch of documents, and subsequent to that, things came up to indicate that maybe they hadn't fully complied with that request in terms of everything related to certain issues. You've made certain requests in connection with your audit. If you ask for all documentation, anything relevant to this particular issue, this particular lease, how do you know that they're giving you everything? And is there some procedure that you follow to ensure that what you ask for, you're getting?
That's a really good question. And I guess the answer is we don't know. So we expect every agency to fully participate and cooperate with us in the course of an audit. So just like what the committee did is we asked for documents, and we may ask multiple times for documents. And we accept whatever they gave us to be responsive, completely responsive, all of the documents they have relating to whatever we've requested. If during the course of an audit, during an interview, for instance, or when we look at a document, it refers to another document that we don't have, or during an interview, someone refers to a document that we don't have, we follow up, we'll ask, hey, you know what? Do you have a copy of this document? We didn't get that. Could you provide that to us? We never think that someone is intentionally withholding anything. We just know that departments have a lot of information, and sometimes their record keeping is not the greatest. So we may not get everything that we asked for the very first time. So we keep being persistent. I think the big safety net for us is this process that we have in our audit process, where we engage the agency at the very end of the audit. And I tell the director at the entrance conference, the exit conference, throughout the process, that part of our hope is that we didn't miss anything, that we all agree on the factual foundation for the audit findings. So when we have an exit conference, for instance, when they have the draft report, it really is an opportunity for the department to say, whoa, how did you say this? What about all these documents? And then when we say, hey, we didn't get these, they may say, oh, it's in the box in the corner. Darn it, we didn't give it to you. So that doesn't happen, but that might be another safety net in the sense of, did we get all the material? So if there's something that's significant to the finding that the department has in a document, and they think, hey, you missed this, you didn't consider this, you didn't include this, and we talk about that and we find out we don't even have it, hopefully that will get us that document. And if it is important for our analysis, we will go back and reassess the finding or different aspects of the report.
Understood. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Vice Chair Yamashita?
I'll ask something. So Auditor Condo, one of your comments was that the department pointed to what other departments were doing, and to some degree you said that had no relevance on your investigation. But at the same time, I'm wondering if you looked into other departments that do lease land, and I agree sometimes that we have to get best and highest use out of property, but also we have to be cognizant that sometimes government has a public purpose also, and so we have to kind of look at maybe consistency and maybe how other departments are leasing out their assets. In your investigation, did you look at any other practices, take for example airports or others, to find consistency or some kind of rhyme or reason why we do things?
Representative, first, I'm going to correct you. We didn't do an investigation. We did an audit. So an audit is a assessment of a broad process and not a one particular aspect of something that you might know isn't going well. The answer to your question is no, we didn't look at the other departments. We didn't audit them. We weren't auditing, Dlnr, airports or harbors or anyone else. We were auditing Dlnr and their administration of the Special Land and Development Fund. I also want to make a comment because you made in response to one of your comments, we're not saying every parcel that the land division administers should be maximized in terms of the revenue. We're saying that there's certain parcels, the commercial and industrial parcels, those lands, those have been designated as income producing. Those income producing lands, they should be getting fair market rent. The other lands, the lands like, for instance, that there may be designated for ag or for some other types of state policy to push a state policy like high tech or renewable energy, those lands, the board should consider below market rent just so that they can encourage those activities on those state lands. We're not talking about those lands. We're talking about the commercial and industrial properties that we assessed.
Yeah, I think you made that point earlier.
Okay,
but,
sorry.
Yeah, but you know what? I'll reserve questions for later. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Representative Vice Chair Peruso.
Yeah, I do have a couple additional questions. So the first is, I understand that this was a procurement audit that got expanded to a performance audit, and it is not a financial audit. And I heard your response to Chair Hashem's question about fraud. I think that my follow-up question to that is, there is a concern about the appearance of unethical behavior when leases are extended on the basis of existing relationships and not on the basis of very strict guidelines and parameters that create a fair playing field for all those involved. And so my question, getting to the question, is if you think that the legislature should step in and provide those procedures if the agencies are unable to, if it creates this appearance of unethical behavior.
Obviously that's the legislature's policy decision, but I would suggest that the procedures and processes to implement the statute, to achieve the statutory mission of the program or the agency, should be at the agency level, because the legislature probably can't get into the weeds to the level to develop policies and procedures without interfering in the day-to-day actual day-to-day stuff the agency does. But okay. It's something that the agency needs to implement, and the legislature can insist the agency implements policies and procedures. Because I think your comment about that there were the guidelines and parameters that you were mentioning, those are the policies and procedures that should guide the department and the board in its consideration of these lease extensions and other types of activities that they do. And they don't have those.
I hear that. And I think that's probably right. But do you think the legislature can at least be useful in helping to elaborate in statute vision and mission for the agencies around these programs? Because I feel like while there may be some language, it definitely hasn't been revisited recently. And I do think that our context has changed over the decades. So, and I know you might also say that this is like above your pay grade, but do you have thoughts around that?
Well, it is above my pay grade, but I think what you're describing is more applicable to ADC. Where 30 years later, things have changed, right? And opportunities may have been lost. With the land division and the Department of Land and Natural Resources, I'm unclear if there's things that are stale or times have changed. But that really is your guys' call. With the department's assistance, of course.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Next, Representative Chair Hashem.
I don't have a question.
Vice Chair Ichiyama.
Thank you, Chair. Auditor, just following up on my last line of questioning, you know, it's a little bit of a musical chairs here. I went back and I looked at the report submitted by your office to the legislature at the end of 2020, the consolidated one that you were referencing. And let me pull that up real quick here so I can reference November.
What's the report number, Representative?
2019 annual report. It was submitted to the legislature November 24th, 2020. I hope I'm looking at the correct.
Are you okay? Go ahead and ask your question. I'm sorry.
I just wanted to make sure that I'm looking at the correct report, because I think it would be in this consolidated report that you were saying would be the department's response to your June 30, 2020 status update letter.
No, I'm sorry. It's not in the annual report. We produce a report that includes all of the department's self-reported status of their implementation of audit recommendations. I'm sorry, I'm not looking at you because I'm trying to find the report so I can reference it to you. I'm sorry, I'm not doing a very good job of that.
Maybe in the interest of time, if you can just send us the title or number of the report just directly to the committee, just to make sure that we are looking at the correct report that we should.
Yes. Okay, so like we issued on November 4th, 2020, we issued report number 20-15, report on the implementation of state auditors' recommendations 2015 to 2018. So these are relate to audit recommendations made within that period, 2015 to 2018. So it's the self-reported status. The reason why you will not find Dlnr's self-reported status in that report is because our audit was issued in 2019. So the report on the implementation of the status that we will issue this year will include Dlnr's self-reported implementation status for SLDF or the SLDF audit. I'm sorry if that was confusing. I was kind of stumbling all over the place, but.
Okay, got it. So we would see that in this year's consolidated report.
Correct. I mean, I gotta hope that Dlnr would just give you a copy of what they sent to us if requested.
And then one other follow-up question, Chair, if I may. In your audit, as you mentioned, the department is allowed to review the draft report and make comments. And their comments at the end of the report, see if I can find it so I can refer it to you on page 54. So it's their letter to the auditor, June 13th, 2019. Their comment was that we note that contrary to past practice and despite our follow-up request, the auditor's proposed recommendations were not included with the draft report, and we are therefore unable to comment on the recommendations.
Yes.
So I just was wondering if you had a response to that?
Yes. And we told this to Dlnr at the time, and as I mentioned during my presentation, the recommendations are our suggestions as to how to address the things that we found were not going well. There are suggestions. They're not a basis for the department to provide comment. The opportunity that we're providing the department is to offer their perspective, their comments on the audit and the audit findings specifically. Those are the important parts of that. That is the important part of the report. And that's why I mentioned during my presentation that I would strongly encourage the committee to focus on the audit findings. So if there's a better way or a different way to fix things, to address those findings, all for it, just go for it, right? Our recommendations are just our suggestions. Sorry, I was trying to look at the camera, look at the little picture, and all of a sudden it changed. But anyway, so that's my response to your question, or your statement, I guess. It's the recommendations aren't necessary for the department to consider when it looks at the draft, because those are just suggestions as to how to fix what we found. The department should focus on the findings.
I see. And so it is custom and practice when the auditor submits a draft report to an agency to not include the draft recommendations.
Not always, but in this case, we did not. In ADC, we did not.
And is there a standard or a guideline that determines when you include them or don't include them in the draft?
No, I think that as we were going through the drafting process, we're trying to get the agency as much time as we can give them to review the draft. And like I've been saying, the main important part of the report is really the audit finding. And that's what we want the agency to have an opportunity to read, consider, and provide us comments and discuss it with us.
I know I've asked more than two questions, so thank you, Chair.
I have two questions in two areas. I just want to follow up on Vice Chair Ichiyama's questions about the report, the follow-up report. So we have a letter, and I think what's getting confusing is that the date of the letter. We have a letter from your office, auditor, dated June 30th, 2020, that required the status implementation follow-up due on July 31st, 2020. We have only seen a response that would have been the status implementation recommendation would have been dated July 20, 2021 from Dlnr. So did they respond to this letter by July 31st, 2020?
I don't know.
Okay, and then if you would have given an extension, do you recall giving them an extension to this?
I don't know.
Okay, can you please check your records to see, and we'll certainly ask Dlnr if they followed and responded to this, and why, if they were given a free pass not to respond, because if they had responded to this, then in fact, it would have been able to go into your November 4th, 2020 annual report, correct?
We report the implementation status, the self-reported implementation status in that report that I was describing to the Vice Chair.
Okay, so, and I guess that's the question, is you would have gotten the status implementation report as of July 31st. And I know how dogged you are, auditor. So the fact that there isn't a response to this and it's not in the annual report is very curious. Any recollection as to why it's not included?
No, as I was explaining to the Vice Chair, the report that I was referencing is a compilation of the recommendations that were made, the status of the implementation of the recommendations that were made in audits that we issued from 2015 through 2018. This audit of the SLDF was issued in 2019, so it would not have been included in that compilation report.
Where would this have been included, or you would have just held this into your working papers?
It will be included in the next report that we issue.
So conceivably, you'll have two reports then?
No, we do a consolidated, comprehensive report that consolidates all of the agency's self-reported implementation status. That was the report that I was referencing for the Vice Chair, report 20-15. That was issued November of 2020. Okay, so we issue that annually. And that report, again, it consolidates all of the self-reported status, implementation status that's reported to us.
And if they had provided you a document as of July 31st, 2020, even though it would not have had to have gone in the annual report, is it something that you could have, in fact, reported to the legislature to provide us with information?
I guess we could report anything to the legislature, but our process allows the agency, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me that if we issue a report in January of this year and we come back 3 months later and say, what have you done? Most agencies are not nimble enough to be able to do much to address significant findings that we've made. I discussed the fact that we don't want to make insignificant findings, immaterial issues. We don't want to raise those. We want to make change, meaningful change in the process to improve the agency's operations. So it's not meaningful for us to go back 3 months, 6 months later to say, hey, have you fixed all of the findings? Have you implemented the recommendations? Like I said, most agencies are not that nimble, not that quick, not that fast. So we usually allow an agency a couple years to start to implement the recommendations. And that's why we come back and we do our active follow-up 2 to 3 years after the audit has been issued. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but we don't go back and get implementation status from an audit immediately after we issue the audit. There's a little cushion of time so that the agency can actually start implementation or actually implement.
Okay, well, I'm just following up on the document that it was a letter issued from your office to Chair Case. So we'll continue to follow up. And if there are reports like that, and if it requires legislative activity, we'll consider that as well. My second question is in the area of scope. So I want to return back to the scope issue. And then again, in House Bill 839, Senate Conference Draft 1, again, some of the focus of the actual conference draft asked you to look at whether contractors and awardees were adequately screened and qualified. So my sense was, based upon your report, you really focused on lease and revocable permits, but those aren't the only contracts that SLDF Land Division enters into. Did you examine any other contracts or items, and why or why not?
Well, we looked at ICUN. The reason for that, Representative, is because we went through our planning process. This audit was no different than every other audit we do. We went through our process. We have a very robust process that complies with the Yellow Book. So we went through our planning process. We went through a risk assessment that I was describing earlier in my presentation, and we risked out certain activities of the agency, and we risked in and created objectives relating to things that we thought were meaningful and important.
Okay, so your call was to focus in on the lease and revocable permits, and you didn't look at other contracts that SLDF might have been responsible for. Is that correct? And that would have been documented in your working papers.
Yeah, we would have gone through our process. That's correct.
Okay, so if in the discovery there were evidence of contracts that went beyond the leases and revocable permits that might have touched on this issue of contractors and awardees of other contracts, right? Going back to the scope of the language of the actual bill that authorized you. Was there any evidence that you might have seen where contracts were awarded to one company, why there might have been or seen any change orders and period extensions, including change order amounts that were larger than the original contracts that were granted? Or would you have seen any evidence of purchase orders issued to subcontractors for additional work that might have been suspect? And finally, if so, can you describe if you saw any of those documents, or if your staff reviewed any of those types of documents?
I think the difference between, and maybe I didn't do a very good job of explaining our audit process. I think the difference between what you're describing and what we do is, kind of the correction I made to Representative Yamashita is, we're not investigators, we're auditors. We're auditing a process. So we're looking at a horizontal level at a process. So that's what that risk assessment is the purpose for that. It's identifying the key activities in that process and identifying risks to those activities to be able to achieve the key activity objective. That's what we do. So if you're asking me, did we look at this or that? We would have looked at the certain handful of the contracts, but it's more so we could get a feel of the process. So in planning, we're talking to the department, we're looking at documents that detail the process. And then if we had elected to make—
Auditor Condo, I think I understand your response, but I want to go back because the scope of your—
It wasn't done.
Go ahead.
I don't think my response was done yet, but that's okay, go ahead.
Okay, go ahead and finish your response, but then I would like to go back to the scope as outlined in the statute that authorized you. So go ahead and finish.
One Once we develop objectives, then we go and do field work, like I was explaining. And at that point, it's very likely that we're going to test the process. So what that means, we're going to gather information with respect to a selected group of, for instance, contracts to ensure that, or to test or assess whether the agency followed that process that they have. And if they didn't, why not? And if they didn't, what is the big deal? What is the effect of that? So that's the audit process. So when you're describing or asking, did we look at this or that? I don't know, but in terms of our planning work, we're looking more at a higher level at a process.
Okay, I understand that. Thank you. So then my question is, because the authorizing bill that created your work identified contractors and awardees, if the documentary evidence that was presented to you had any concerns of irregularity, would you turn a blind eye to that irregularity?
Of course not. If we had seen, for instance, fraud, I think that was a question that somebody had asked, we are obligated to report it, and we would have reported it. And you know, a good example for me is we do a report, an audit of the bottle program, the deposit beverage container deposit program, which is the 5 cents that you and I pay when we buy a soda or can of beer or whatever. We reported actual fraud, and we reported that to the department as soon as it was uncovered, and we included it in our report.
Okay, great. So you do have standards for fraud, but I guess notwithstanding fraud, if evidence is produced to you from an agency that then becomes responsive to the authorizing statute that created the audit, even though that might have fallen out of the audit objectives, you would have disregarded that? Would you have been flexible enough to expand the scope given the information provided to you if it's consistent with the authorizing statute?
I think it's a hard question for me to answer without more information or context, but I guess the answer is maybe.
And then what would be the standards that would point you in that direction? Or would that have to come up from the field staff? They would come in when you have your, what you described as your meetings. Would the field staff have come up with potential other issues that would have been brought to the team to be considered?
I think during the course of the audit, just broadly, but especially during planning, the audit team is gathering a lot of information. And there's meetings that we have with the team that I sit in, and sometimes I don't sit in those meetings, where the team is sharing that information with each other. And that all builds to, you know, the risk assessment and the forming of the objectives. And then that continues to build to the PF&R document that I was describing.
So that's where the omissions would occur, potentially. The decisions to make or not follow up on irregularities would be made at the fieldwork level or your level?
It depends on, I don't really understand that those general, very broad questions. I guess it could be both. We have a project supervisor who's a manager. We have a senior analyst who is the day-to-day lead. We call that the AIC, or analyst in charge. And we have a number of analysts, usually about 2, sometimes 3 analysts that are part of that audit team. So they work as a group.
Okay, but then again, so those kinds of questions and concerns would have been brought up through the fieldwork process. At what point would any of that kind of investigatory work have been brought up to you so that there would be a decision to omit or include or change the objectives to be more flexible?
I'm not, I think the only reason why I'm hesitating is because if we saw an illegal activity, whether it's within the scope of the audit, within the objectives or not, we would report that. We would not report that like in our report. We would report that to the department director. We would report that to the legislature, right? We would do a separate letter or a separate way to convey that information immediately. right? In the report itself, if we saw fraud or some other illegal activity, but it was outside of the scope of our objectives, we might include a text box about it, but we've addressed it by raising the issue, notifying the legislature and the department head of what we saw.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Auditor. I think that's the last for my scope. I have a number of other questions in different areas, but I do want to, again, rotate back through the list. So Chair Tarnish, you're up next.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that, Chair. I'd like to turn my attention now to the whole issue you brought up, Auditor Condo, about ceded land revenues, and your questioning the Land Division Administrator's interpretation of the statutory provision that created the SLDF, because he has stated that after paying OHA their 20% share of ceded land revenues, the rest of that 80% then could fund the Land Division and other Dlnr programs. But you've cast doubt on whether these uses are consistent with the purposes for which ceded land revenues can be used. Wasn't there a land board decision that actually approved this arrangement where the 80% went into SLDF, and did not the land board do that analysis? Because this is something that all of us have to be aware of, is the 5 specific purposes for which ceded land revenues can be spent. Did you find that the land board did not evaluate that sufficiently? Is that why you're saying that they are sort of, taking, making decisions that really are the legislative's decisions?
No, that's not what we said. I think you're correct that it's not all of the ceded lands that the revenue from those ceded lands that Dlnr or the Land Division keeps. It's some of them.
Well, it's the income producing assets that they decide, right? So it's that.
Well, they selected some. Yeah. I think our comment was more about whether or not the policy call to use those lands for one of the 5 purposes that are articulated in the Admission Act for ceded land revenues, whether or not that was at your level, was a policy call as to how the legislature or the programs the legislature may want to fund to support education or one of the other purposes that are in the Admissions Act for use of ceded land revenues. And that was not a call at the level of the land administrator or Dlnr. Dlnr doesn't do education, for instance. I think the only purpose is the land development or whatever it is that is one of the 5 purposes for use of the ceded land revenues. So it really was an issue that we raised so that the legislature and maybe even OHA would be aware that ceded land revenues were not coming to the general fund, that you were not controlling, the legislature, were not controlling how those ceded land revenues would be spent, and the policies or the programs that you thought in your role as a legislator would be more appropriate to fund versus decisions being made by the land administrator and the board.
So you said that they really need to seek guidance from the legislature about whether the department is authorized to keep and spend these ceded land revenues without specific legislative approval. So is that's your recommendation then, is that they really should come to us and ask whether what they're doing is appropriate? Yeah,
so if it's the legislature's intent that the department maintain or keep those ceded land revenues to fund the limited activities of the Land Division, at least in relationship to the 5 activities that ceded land revenues are supposed to fund, then that's your call. But that's a policy decision that, in our opinion, was at a higher level than at the Land Division. So yes, that was the recommendation. Come and get guidance, clarify it with the legislature so that it's clearer that the Land Division is entitled to retain those revenues and use it for the Land Division's purposes. And I want to note that not all of the Land Division's activities and all the other agencies that they fund, I don't know if it all fits under the 5 the purposes for the ceded land revenues. That's another question, but
you did not do that analysis.
No, we did not. We did not assess that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
And frankly, can I add one more comment, Rep? frankly, I don't know.
There's a half hour that I want to keep to, so if we can cycle through, is Representative Minority Leader Okimoto on? Go ahead.
Yep, I'm on. I don't have another question, but if Auditor Condo wanted to end his thought, he can do it right now.
No, I'll let him do a closing comment and he can wrap those things up. We're under. Chair Kobayashi.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to get a little more clarification on your setting of scopes and how they may be altered by what you find out. So I know you've been asked in general terms, okay, if you find out there's something odd going on, how do you decide what to follow up on and who decides that? So I understand why it's difficult to answer in terms of just a general question because it depends. Being an ex-auditor, I've been in a similar situation on what do you follow up on and how. But you've also been asked specifically, what would you do? So I think the context was of the account receivable collection or lack thereof, that the agency or the department's response to why don't they collect money they're owed was that, well, everybody does it. Nobody collects money. So the question posed to you was, well, why didn't you audit everybody then? So, which would be kind of a lot. So if it's something that big, where the response from the department is that, well, it's widespread that money that should benefit the taxpayers is not being collected, a very large thing. And if you wanted to expand things to say, okay, well, let's look at account receivables for all of the agencies that they mentioned, that's quite an undertaking. Would you, what in that situation, do you come to us and get authorization and funding, or what would it? I mean, would you even feel responsible for looking at every department that might be lax in collecting account receivables based on that response from Dlnr? So just using that as a specific example.
I think there's multiple responses to that, Representative. I think the first one is just because the land division or the department has alleged it, I don't think that doesn't mean it's true for sure. And I don't think that's causing us to go and now want to audit all of the different agencies, the 10 or whatever that they've listed, and it says ETC at the end of their list. So we're not going to audit all of the departments and agencies that receive any kind of rent revenue or any kind of license fees or whatever else, because that is a huge undertaking unless directed by the legislature. And if so directed, we would come and ask you to narrow the scope of that because we don't have the ability to look at 10 different departments and their activities. I think the bigger response to your question is, like I said at the end of my discussion, I think if you need to filter out the smoke or the noise. What we reported and what we found is the department doesn't have a way to monitor its accounts receivable. They don't reconcile it with the state's, the DAGS' accounting system. There's no reconciliation. DAGS accounting is the state's official accounting records. If they don't match with what Dlnr has, there's a concern there. I think that issue may have been addressed. I think that was an issue that we saw when we retained at Dlnr's request the financial auditors. They had some challenges, but I think that may now, 2 years or 3 years later, that hopefully is addressed. But that was one of the big findings, is that there was no reconciliation of the lease rents. There was no ability for the department to understand the rents that were 60 days and older, the accounts receivable. So those are the bigger issues. It's not so much, oh, everyone else has problems. It's, these are your problems. You have $7 whatever million at that time that were accounts receivable. You had over $2 million that were over 60 days old, right? And we're identifying the fact you don't have controls, you don't have processes in place to ensure collection of those rents. Percentage rent, that was another issue that we raised. There was only 5 properties or some small number of properties that Dlnr has or manages that has a percentage rent requirement in their lease. But they're relying completely on the self-reported amounts for that that percentage rent. There's no control or oversight to ensure that those are accurate. That's
Okay.
what.
Vice Chair or Chair Kobayashi, one more follow-up on this area, and if you can move on to the next questioner. Go ahead.
Okay,
Do you have a follow-up?
okay, so in general, the response that other departments are also shirking their fiduciary responsibility on accounts receivable is generally not acceptable as a excuse for this.
I think it's not addressing the findings. It's not addressing their problems that we identified. And that to me is what you guys should be doing. And what we do in our follow-up is and anyway, that's the bigger deal is their operations. We didn't look at anyone else's operations. We didn't audit those other departments.
Thank you.
Thank you. Rep. Yamashita, did you reserve some time for questions? Vice Chair Yamashita?
Yeah, I'm fine right now, Chair. Thank you.
Representative Peruso? Question, Vice Chair Ichiyama. Okay, I have a number of questions in different subject areas, and I will try to make this brief. We've talked a little bit about scope. The next area is the board-related findings.
What? I'm sorry. I'm sorry. What did you say?
The board-related findings that you made. And this is a little sensitive, but because it was quoted in your audit, I think it is something that we need to explore. Did the audit team's work reveal, and do you believe that Dlnr board members have indirect interest in extending leases when many of their friends are lessees?
I don't know what you're asking, and I think that we reported the facts. We reported what was told to us. If we had factual information or other audit evidence that would suggest that someone is doing something, quote, improperly, illegally, we would report that. And like I mentioned earlier, if it's illegal, we would report that separately.
So in the audit, you're specifically quoting a former land board member who says, essentially to the effect of, well, they were our friends, so that's why we felt like we had to extend the lease. And so that is in your report. So is that evidence of indirect interest?
I don't know what indirect interest means, but it's evidence that there should be a process that's fairer and more objective so that other people who may have interest in leasing land have that opportunity. And that should not be a factor in the decision as to whether or not to let the lease expire so that the department can consolidate those properties and generate more revenue. Is that what you're asking me?
Well, I'm asking what the evidence revealed when you investigated, if there was, and do you believe that there's indirect interest that board members may have had?
We don't investigate, we audit. And we obtain the statements in response to questions that we're asking. And that was that board member's response to the question when we asked, how come the leases were extended?
Okay, so let's assume that was evidence. It's a quote in your audit report. And let's say that it's an interest. Maybe it's not an indirect, it's just an interest that influenced the board member, neither bad nor good. Was there any other evidence that you or your audit team came across that involved board members' evidence of interest that could have been reported to the legislature?
I don't see okay, first of all, I'm not sure what you mean by interest. I didn't understand that the board member who we quoted had an interest in those properties or in those businesses. They were people he knew.
A relationship interest, a friendship interest.
Hawaii's a small place, and I'm sure that many of the people that are lessees know people either on the board or other places, but we didn't look at that. Are we aware of any other? If we were aware of statements by others that raise questions about the process, the fairness of the process, the objectivity of the process, we would have reported it. So I guess my answer to your question is not aware.
Okay. Again, related to the board's findings or the findings you made on the board, do you believe or have you reviewed evidence from your work, the audit team's work, or the contractor's work that Dlnr administration and our staff provided sufficient information and analysis to the board in order for the board to make good decisions?
You mean, do we look at the quality of the information provided by staff to the board?
Yes.
Is that your question?
Yes.
No, we didn't look at the quality.
Okay. So you didn't look at what the recommendations were to the board to further inform them about the decisions that they were making?
No, that's not what I said. I said we didn't look at the quality of those recommendations or the quality of the submissions. We looked at the submissions to the board. In fact, I quoted some during my presentation this morning, but we didn't look at the quality of that, whether it's we didn't look at the quality of those recommendations.
Okay. My next area of questioning, members, I do want to defer to you, members on the call. Do you have any further questions before I move? I'm going to move to the financial audit process.
I just have one question, but I can wait.
Oh, no, go ahead, Chair Tarnas. Go ahead.
It's just a follow-up to your earlier comment, Auditor Condo, when you were saying that, for the industrial and commercial leases, you're really seeking to, you're urging Land Division to maximize revenues. But you also mentioned in a comment, I think I heard you say that for leasing other properties for other uses like agriculture or high tech or renewable energy, there could be rationale for offering below market rent. It could be very appropriate. What's the basis for the distinction that you made in that interpretation? Is that in the statute, or how do you draw that distinction?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the portfolio of lands that Dlnr manages or Land Division manages is quite diverse. In fact, I think that they've told us, and I think we reported that they have, kind of the garbage lands. I don't think that's totally true, but some of the more prime lands perhaps are managed or owned by other agencies or departments. I think that's what that comment was suggesting. So there are lands that are not prime lands that can't generate that kind of revenue. And it may be ag lands, and the state certainly seems to have a policy that promotes agriculture, and to promote those types of state policies, and maybe it's a board policy, then I don't think that we're critical of that. I think, though, that these lands, the ones that we were auditing, the ones that we talked about, those weren't those lands. Those were the income properties, the ones that are supposed to fund SLDF and, in essence, the Land Division and other Dlnr divisions. So, the less that they fund, the less money that they get, the more money they're going to have to take out of SLDF. And the less opportunities that the board or the department has, and perhaps the legislature, to use that money to fund other programs and perhaps even to bring back into the general fund. So, it's really a policy call at that point, whether if the legislature or you, representative, don't think that that should be the mandate, that they can get $1 for renting Aloha Stadium to Bruno Mars or whatever, then that's your call. That's not my call. We just looked at the process that the Land Division was using to manage its income properties.
Yeah, understood. I was just trying to understand your comment about how it might be appropriate to offer discounted lease rents for certain uses. Okay, thank you very much. Back to you, Chair.
Chair Kobayashi or Rep. Peruso?
Representative Okimoto, do you have anything?
Is Representative Okimoto on the line still? Go ahead, Representative Okimoto.
I don't have any more. Thank you.
Chair Kobayashi?
Okay, thank you, Chair. I just wanted to get clarification on one of the processes you described at the beginning of your presentation. In financial auditing, we call it report referencing. I don't know how you guys look at it, but it's the process by which an individual looks at the final finished report and ensures that every single statement in there is documented with supporting documentation. So there could be differences in the way we look at it in financial auditing versus for government auditor. But I've referenced dozens of reports. Now, what was important is that I never referenced a report that I was the audit in charge on, or the audit manager, because it's important to have a outside person looking at it. So I only reference reports for audits that I did not work on. For this audit in particular, I'd be interested to know, was the report referenced by somebody who worked on these particular audits, or do you have a policy to ensure that whoever references reports, in other words, whoever ensures that each item in there is supported by proper documentation, do you ensure, is it okay for you to have somebody who worked on the audit do that? Or does it have to be similar to how we do in the private sector, somebody outside that particular audit?
Yeah, that's our independent review process that I was describing. The independent review is done by a staff member who is not part of the audit team. So that person is, quote, independent from the audit. So yes, every sentence, literally every sentence is referenced. And we do it electronically now, where you can click that link and it takes you right to the document. And actually the document itself is even referenced even more to the specific paragraph, and sometimes even the specific sentence that supports whatever is said in the draft report. Yes, every sentence.
Okay, yeah, in the old days, we just did it all manually. So now it should be a much more robust process. But that answers my question. Thank you.
Thank you. Rep. Russo? Rep. Ichiyama? Okay, Auditor Kondo, I have some questions on the KKDLY financial audit. It is in the audit report. Can you please provide the committee with a copy of the contract that you initiated with KKDLY for their work? We did appropriate $100,000, I believe, for this.
You can do that.
Okay, thank you. It says in this appendix that KKDLY identified all potential revenues and sources of revenues credited to SLDF. And then in the page 46 after it, it just lumps all of those revenues in sort of these big categories. Was there a further identification of what all those potential revenues and sources of revenues done by KKDLY?
I don't recall.
Okay, the importance is because if to get an understanding of how much of lease and RP income comes from those contracts or those big line items would have been helpful. Appendix A also indicates that KKDLY prepared a schedule of expenditures by cost category, and that vendors paid more than $100,000 in aggregate were reviewed further. It looks like Appendix C provides a summary of IUCN vendors paid more than $100,000, but is this list that was generated by KKDLY, it looks like it was broader than just the IUCN, and it should have been broader than just the IUCN. So we would have seen vendors across SLDF's contracts. Is that correct?
No, exhibit or Appendix C, I think, relates specifically to ICUN contracts. Is that what you're asking me?
No, so the scope of work identified in the KKDLY says that they should have identified vendors who were paid more than $100,000 in aggregate. There was no limitation there of IUCN. So if there were other expenses in other categories, that should have been supplied to you by KKDLY. Is that correct?
I don't know.
Yeah, if you can't recall, can you please provide the committee, if it's in possession of KKDLY, and I hope it is because that looks like it was in their scope, the complete list of vendors paid more than $100,000 in aggregate, and whether the contracts and expenditures documentation that you might have regarding those vendors, and if any of these contractors and awardees were screened and qualified?
I think that, Representative, I think that I've tried to describe our audit process, and I think that we complied with that audit process, complied with the Yellow Book requirements. So it went through whatever process that we employed at that time, and it got peer review. It got independent reviewed, like I was describing to Representative Kobayashi. So we reported what we thought we needed to report, and it's in this report. So when you're asking me for information outside of the report, things that are beyond what we reported, I'm not sure how appropriate that is, because this is our report. And if you have questions about the report and you don't understand things about the report, you need clarification about the report and the processes that we use, Happy to answer that. But this is our report.
Okay, so I'm asking that in your scope of work for KKDLY, important provision is prepared a schedule of expenditures by cost category, selected vendors that were paid more than $100,000 in aggregate, and reviewed invoices for proper approval for compliance with procurement procedures and for propriety of disbursements. So what I'm asking you, and I'm just seeking clarification now, is did KKDLY create this list? They must have, because it's in their scope of work. Can you provide us with that list? And will it show that it was applied to vendors beyond just the IUCN, which would have been consistent with our authorizing statute that asked you to look at contract vendors?
I don't know to answer your question.
Okay, so perhaps I think this is important. We're going to have to maybe follow up as a further follow up with KKDLY. I think there is one last.
Can I respond to that though?
If you can respond to whether or not there was a schedule done pursuant to item 5 under scope of work in Appendix A, sure.
No, I want to respond to your comment about following up with KKDLY.
I think that's out of the scope of this question at the moment, but you can certainly respond in the closing comments if you want. I have one other area. So preserving the conflict of interest is certainly something that all agencies should be concerned with. And there are standards in the Yellow Book to assess risk threats from within your own audit team. Did you conduct those risk threats with the staff and members of the audit team? And did you find any risk threats pursuant to this Yellow Book standard?
Yeah, we always do it. We require people to sign statements of independence for every audit, people on the audit team.
And that was conducted for all of the staff members?
Correct.
Okay. Was there any that had a risk threat?
Sorry, excuse me, I'm interrupting you, but for all of the project team.
Okay, can you explain the distinction?
Yeah, we have an office of 21 people. Not everyone is working on the SLDF audit. So we're not asking somebody that is working on a different audit to sign a statement of independence relating to our work on the SLDF audit.
So you check for the risk threat of members of the audit team for a particular audit. That's what you're saying.
We're ensuring that the team members are independent.
And if there is a risk threat of a person not on the team, is there any attempt to ensure that if they do present a threat, that they will not work on the audit? Representative, I know what you're talking about. I wish that you would talk in more specifics and not in so much generalities. So we have 2 employees, which the chair raised, never to us during the audit. In fact, throughout the audit, we told the board chair that there were 2 former employees of the land division that work in this office. And we told her multiple times throughout the audit that those employees were not part of the audit team and they would not be involved in our audit. They were in essence firewalled from this. Nevertheless, after we issued our report and the Star Advertiser wrote an editorial urging the department to do a better job managing its lands, the chair wrote a commentary to the paper accusing us very irresponsibly, in my opinion, without any evidence to suggest anything, accusing us of allowing the 2 employees who used to work for her land division of being involved. Okay, first of all, that wasn't the case. And I wrote a letter that I copied all legislators on back to her, telling her that that was irresponsible and frankly, it was insulting. So if you're asking me about those 2 employees, they were not involved in this audit. And the implication or the innuendo that we somehow didn't ensure that the people that are on this audit team were independent, that's a big deal for us.
So anyway, we made sure that people were independent. We were very aware of the fact that we had 2 former land division employees that were part of our office at the time.
So just to correct the record and clarify, I'm asking to provide that opportunity for you to clarify. And it has come to our attention that yes, agency staff had been recruited by your office. So thank you for that clarification. But I also wanted to ensure that the firewall procedures are maintained, and then they are also documented, both in your threat assessments that you should be doing pursuant to Yellow Book standards, as well as the letters and correspondence that you have provided to Chair Case and provided to the media. Is that correct?
I'm not sure what you're referring to as the threat assessments that are required by the Yellow Book. I explained that the team signed statements of independence. So if that's what you're referring to, yes, that is documented. I'm sorry, I didn't understand, or I don't recall the rest of your question.
Okay, my understanding of the Yellow Book, my understanding of the Yellow Book standards is that there is a formal process of threat assessments, and perhaps we can revisit this another time, but that these would have then been documented, and that members of the audit team would have been instructed not to speak with those individuals who might have been compromised, because we don't want to, in fact, compromise the independence and integrity of the audit. Is that correct?
Yes, that's true. That is absolutely correct. If the committee or Dlnr believes that there was influence or information by the 2 former employees, I want to hear it. Rather than walking around the bush and throwing out these accusations and these suggestions, I want to hear it, because it didn't happen. We do statements of independence, and we are very protective of the fact that we are independent, that we are objective, that we are nonpartisan, that we are unbiased in our work. So, I hate to hear these suggestions and everything else that you're throwing out there, Chair, because it didn't happen. And if you think it did, let's talk about it, because having those suggestions out there is, like I said, to the chair, to the board chair, it's insulting. And especially given that there's no proof.
Thank you, Auditor Condo, for your comments. I mean, I do agree. I think we are looking to where the evidence leads us, and that's the responsibility of this committee. So we do have to ask tough questions, and I appreciate your candor. For the purposes of this committee, you said there were independent statements of the audit team, but is there any other further verification that the audit team was instructed not to talk to the individuals that would have been documented in the audit working papers?
Not sure.
Okay, thank you. Certainly there are a lot more questions, but as I promised, we're going to try to maintain this to noon. We are 5 minutes away from that. The committee has further procedural matters to take care of. Thank you, Chair Condo, for your opportunity. I'll give you a few minutes to make any kind of closing statement. And please keep in mind, we will likely call you back. This committee has really only started its investigatory work because we have received numerous documents since the conclusion of the audit. So we are still going through numerous documents and working to clarify the questions that we'll be asking of different witnesses. So you will likely be called back. Don't worry about that, Auditor Condo. And if you'd like to make a few closing remarks, if we could limit it to 2 to 3 minutes. Please.
Sure, I would like to. I think some of the questions about our process, I think they're well out of line. I explained our process. We followed that process, and we did a report. If the committee or the chair or somebody else thinks that we missed something or that we should have looked at different things, the committee has the opportunity to ask Dlnr about those other things that were outside of the scope of our audit, outside of the objectives of our audit. We answered the objectives. We provided a meaningful report that is supported by sufficient and appropriate audit evidence. If you have questions about that evidence, I am happy to discuss that. But really, I think that some of these questions are outside of the scope of the audit, outside of what we reported. We reported within the 4 corners of our document, and that's what we did. and it's supported. I'm happy to stand behind that report. Anyway, I welcome the opportunity to come back and talk more to you folks. And if you guys have questions, you're welcome to call me and discuss them. I don't know if that's part of the process or not. I know we've had a number of informal discussions with some of the committee members. So I don't know if that's kosher or not, but I make myself available to answer whatever questions that you guys may have, whether formally or informally. You're welcome to give me a call. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you, Auditor Kondo. And just for me to respond, I understand your position. I will say that again, that we do have authorities under Chapter 21. This is a Chapter 21 Legislative Investigative Committee. As you acknowledged, we are conducting informal interviews with all members involved in this. And in addition, employees, former employees, potential board members, we are casting our net widely, as is appropriate for a legislative investigative committee. And so we will do the same thing with regard to the process of this audit. So again, thank you very much, Auditor Kondo. Tomorrow we're going to have Dlnr and their team come and respond to just as much hard questions as you had today, Auditor Kondo. To the members of the committee, I have to take up a procedural matter. At our last meeting where we noticed the testimony for ADC Executive Director and the ADC team for Tuesday, September 21st. We also noticed the hearing and presentation of testimony by Board Chair Phyllis Shimabukuro-Geiser for that same day. Due to my scheduling mishap, and I apologize to the members of the Department of Agriculture, we need to move that hearing testimony of Chair Shimabukuro-Geiser to Thursday, September 23rd at 9:00 a.m. I anticipate that it'll be a shorter one than the ADC, but we still do want to devote time and attention to what the Department of Agriculture has done with respect to the Agribusiness Development Corporation. So my motion is to subpoena the testimony of Chair Phyllis Shimabukuro-Geiser for Thursday, September 23rd, 9 a.m. in conference room 23. Moving forward for the agencies, my request is going to be that to the degree that they have no medical reason why they need to be virtual, I am going to be asking all of them to appear in person, but that there will be an exemption for a medical reason or travel reason additionally for that purpose. We have a tight schedule, so I want to make sure we get this noticed. And so that's my motion to subpoena the chair. Vice Chair? Oh, sorry, any discussion? Members for the rescheduling? I see no one raising their hand, and we do have a quorum. So Vice Chair for the vote.
Chair's recommendation is to issue the subpoena as noted. Chair, Vice Chair vote aye. Rep. Hashem? Excused. Rep. Kobayashi?
Aye.
Rep. Peruso?
Aye.
Rep. Tarnas?
Aye.
Rep. Yamashita?
Aye.
Rep. Okimoto? Aye. Are the recommendations adopted?
Thank you, Vice Chair. I believe that is the only procedural matter that we have to do. Let me inform the committee. I did receive correspondence from attorneys for ADC and Dlnr that has some have to do with discovery and the labeling and mislabeling of some bait stamps. So it's not, I don't think, critical, members, but we're going to sort that out and make sure we have the correct documents in the OneDrive that is available to members and selected legislative staff assisting with this investigation. So I just want to apprise you of that. And the substance of those documents are largely the same, but it may affect future questions. And so I will try to get that cleared up as soon as possible with tech. This has been a challenge, members, so I thank you for your hard work at looking at the over 12,000 documents we have received and the many meetings we've already had and the many meetings we are to have moving forward. If there's no further discussion, members, seeing none, we are adjourned.